Before we begin tonight's story, I want to take just a moment to ask for your support. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know, and allows us to keep bringing you these stories every week. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes an incredible difference and truly helps us reach more people who love this type of content. I'd also love to know, comment below what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're listening from, but only if you want to share. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from around the globe. And if you're new here and enjoying what you hear, please consider subscribing. It means everything. Now let's get into tonight's story. What you're about to hear is not about crashed saucers or alien bodies. There are no dramatic military encounters, no whistleblowers risking everything to come forward. This is about something far more unsettling. A system so efficient at processing information that the truth gets sorted into irrelevance before anyone with authority ever sees it. This is about the reports that were filed, reviewed, and forgotten, and about the person who finally noticed what everyone else was trained to ignore. Intro. The report nobody read. My name doesn't matter. My title was Data Review Specialist, which sounds more impressive than it was. I worked for a contractor that handled aviation incident reports for multiple agencies. Not the Federal Aviation Administration directly, but close enough that we saw everything they saw, just earlier in the process. My job was triage. Every day, thousands of reports came through the system. Pilot observations, maintenance flags, near-miss incidents, weather anomalies, equipment malfunctions, bird strikes, runway incursions. The vast majority were routine. My role was to categorize them, assign priority levels, and route them to the appropriate departments. Most reports died at my desk, not because I decided they weren't important, because the system decided. There were algorithms, decision trees, checkbox criteria. If a report didn't meet certain thresholds, radar confirmation, multiple independent witnesses, measurable threat to aviation safety, property damage, it got marked low priority. Low priority meant it went into an archive that no investigator would ever look at unless they were specifically searching for something. The system worked. It had to. There was too much data for any human team to process completely. We trusted the filters, until I started noticing what the filters were catching. Chapter 1. The incident that almost didn't matter. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September of 2007. I remember because it was the day before my review period ended, and I was trying to clear my queue before the performance metrics locked in. The office was quiet. Most of my colleagues had already left for the day. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and my desk was covered with the usual debris of bureaucratic work. Coffee cups, printed reports with highlighter marks, sticky notes reminding me of follow-up tasks that would never get completed. I was tired. It had been a long week, the kind of week where every report seemed to blend into the next, where the rhythm of categorization and filing became almost meditative in its monotony. Then the report came in. It arrived through the standard commercial aviation channel at 16:43 local time. Flight 437, a red-eye route from Honolulu to Los Angeles, approximately 4 hours into the flight. Position was over open Pacific, well outside normal radar coverage from land-based stations. The timestamp indicated the observation had occurred roughly 2 hours earlier. The captain's report was brief, professional, almost dismissive in tone. Observed unidentified light source at wide, approximate bearing 270 degrees, altitude uncertain, distance uncertain. Object maintained position relative to aircraft for approximately 8 minutes, before departing upward at high velocity. No radar contact, no communication attempts, no threat to flight safety, continuing to destination. I read it once, then twice. By itself, this meant nothing. Pilots see things constantly, reflections off clouds that look solid, distant aircraft at odd angles that appear stationary, satellites catching sunlight during twilight hours, atmospheric phenomena that have scientific names I can't pronounce, sprites, jets, elves, phenomena that occur in the upper atmosphere and create visual effects that seem impossible. The ocean at night plays particular tricks on depth perception. With no reference points, a distant light can appear close. A moving object can appear stationary. A conventional aircraft banking away can seem to accelerate impossibly. The reports would normally get coded as unexplained light source and filed under low priority. I had processed dozens of similar reports over the past year. They were routine, unremarkable. I was about to assign the standard classification when the second report arrived. The notification appeared on my screen at 16:51. Flight 629, different airline, similar route, filed a report 18 minutes after the first one. Same night, same general area of ocean. I opened it immediately. Observed stationary bright object off port side. Object did not correspond to known satellite positions or conventional aircraft. Appeared to maintain fixed position despite prevailing winds at altitude. Lost visual contact when object accelerated vertically beyond visible range. No radar confirmation available. I sat back in my chair. 2 commercial pilots, 2 separate aircraft, same phenomenon, same night. Reports filed within minutes of each other. I checked the flight paths. Both aircraft were travelling. The same general corridor, but separated by approximately 15 minutes of flight time and several miles of lateral distance. They wouldn't have been able to see each other. They couldn't have coordinated their reports, but they had seen the same thing. The algorithm still marked both reports low priority. The logic was simple and unambiguous. No radar meant no objective confirmation. No threat meant no investigation. The reports were automatically queued for the archive. I could have let them go, should have let them go. My performance metrics were based on processing speed, not investigation depth. Every minute I spent examining a low priority report was a minute that counted against my review scores. But something made me pause. It was the language. Both captains used careful, measured descriptions, not excited, not speculative. They wrote like people who had seen something they couldn't explain and were deliberately avoiding sensational language because they knew exactly how these reports were handled. They were trying to be believed, which meant they thought they wouldn't be. The first captain had included his flight hours in the report metadata, over 12,000 hours of commercial aviation experience. The second captain had been flying for nearly 20 years. These were not inexperienced pilots prone to misidentification or panic. I pulled up the weather data for the region at the time of the sightings. Clear skies, minimal cloud cover, excellent visibility. Winds at altitude were strong, over 90 knots, but consistent. Nothing that would explain unusual visual phenomena. I checked satellite tracking data. No satellite passes corresponded to the location and time of the observations. No scheduled military exercises in the area. No civilian rocket launches. Nothing that would explain a bright object maintaining position in high winds. I flagged both reports and linked them in the system. This created a cross-reference that would be visible to anyone who accessed either report in the future. It was a small act of documentation, probably meaningless, but it felt important. Then I did something I wasn't supposed to do. I opened the archive search function and began looking for similar incidents. The search parameters were broad. unidentified objects, high altitude, ocean locations, lack of radar confirmation. I limited the time frame to the previous 2 years, expecting perhaps a handful of matches. The system returned 37 results. I stared at the number on my screen. 37 reports. In 2 years, all matching similar criteria. I should have stopped there. I should have closed the search, filed the 2 new reports, and gone home. But I couldn't. I began reading. Each report told essentially the same story. Object appears at high altitude over water. Object demonstrates unusual flight characteristics. Extended hovering, rapid acceleration, vertical departure, no radar confirmation, no threat to aircraft, low priority classification. Some reports included additional details. One pilot noted that the object appeared to be self-luminous rather than reflective. Another mentioned that the object left no contrail or visible exhaust. Several pilots commented on the acceleration rates, describing them as far beyond anything they had witnessed in decades of aviation experience. But every report ended the same way. No investigation recommended. Filed and forgotten. I checked the clock. It was after 6. The office was empty, except for the night security guard making his rounds. I should have left hours ago. Instead, I expanded my search to 5 years. 63 results. 10 years. 112 results. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. This was a pattern that had been developing for over a decade, documented by reliable witnesses, consistently dismissed by the same automatic filters. I saved the search. Results to my personal drive. Then I flagged both of the new reports for follow-up review. It was a token gesture. Follow-up reviews rarely resulted in actual investigation, but it was the only action available within my authority. I finally left the office at nearly 8 that evening. During the drive home, I kept thinking about those 2 captains, about the careful language they had used, about the fact that they had both taken the time to file reports. They probably knew would be ignored. They had seen something they couldn't explain, something they felt obligated to document, even though they understood the futility of the process. And I was the person who had been trained to make that futility official. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept seeing that number. 112 reports, 112 documented encounters with phenomena that defied explanation. 112 pieces of evidence that had been systematically categorized as unimportant. The next morning, I returned to the office and began a more detailed analysis. I didn't know it then, but that decision would change everything. Chapter 2. The object that broke aviation rules. The archive search took 3 days to complete. The system wasn't designed for pattern analysis. It was designed for retrieval of specific incidents using predefined search categories. I had to manually adjust search parameters, run multiple queries, cross-reference dates and locations, and export data into spreadsheets for analysis. The work was tedious. I had to do it in fragments, between my normal duties, staying late after my colleagues left, arriving early before the office filled up. I told myself I was just being thorough, that this was good due diligence, that any conscientious analyst would do the same thing. But the truth was, I had become obsessed. What I found disturbed me far more than I had anticipated. Over the previous 5 years, there were 17 reports matching similar criteria. Different airlines, different crews, different specific locations, but the same essential description. Object appears over ocean at high altitude. Object holds position despite wind conditions. Object demonstrates acceleration characteristics inconsistent with known aircraft. object departs vertically or at extreme angles. No radar confirmation. 17 incidents, all dismissed as low priority, all filed by experienced commercial pilots who had no reason to fabricate reports and every reason not to include anything that would make them look unreliable or mentally unstable. I began reading the reports more carefully, taking notes, looking for details that the automated classification system might have missed. One captain flying a route from San Francisco to Sydney noted that the object maintained perfect position relative to their aircraft, despite headwinds exceeding 100 knots. He included this detail almost as an afterthought, a technical observation buried in the middle of his report. But the implication was staggering. For something to hover perfectly in those conditions without visible propulsion or control surfaces violated basic physics as we understand it. A helicopter in those winds would be blown backward. A conventional aircraft maintaining position would need to angle into the wind, using thrust and control surfaces to compensate. This object, according to the report, simply held position. No visible means of propulsion, no angular compensation, just perfect motionless hovering in winds that should have been impossible to resist. Another report from a cargo flight crossing the North Pacific described the object accelerating from an apparent stationary position to beyond visual range in under 3 seconds. The pilot estimated and emphasized it was only an estimate based on visual observation, that the acceleration would have exceeded anything survivable by human occupants or conventional materials. I did the mathematics. Even conservative estimates suggested acceleration rates in excess of 50 times the force of gravity. Fighter jets, in extreme maneuvers, rarely exceed 9 or 10 times the force of gravity. And even that is only sustainable for seconds and requires specially trained pilots wearing pressure suits. Anything biological experiencing 50 times the force of gravity would be crushed immediately. Whatever was inside these objects, if anything was inside them at all, was not subject to the same physical limitations that governed human aviation. A third report mentioned something I had glossed over initially. The pilot was flying at approximately 37,000 feet when the object appeared at roughly the same altitude. He observed it for nearly 10 minutes. Then the object departed, not horizontally, not in a gradual climb. It accelerated nearly vertically upward, maintaining visibility for approximately 15 seconds before yet disappearing. The pilot estimated, based on the angle of departure and the time it remained visible, that the object had reached an altitude well beyond 60,000 feet before passing out of visual range, possibly much higher. No known aircraft could perform that maneuver. Conventional aircraft lose engine performance as air pressure decreases. Jet engines require air intake. Rockets require enormous fuel loads for vertical ascent. Nothing in our aviation inventory could transition from hover to near space altitude in under 20 seconds without creating massive visible exhaust, sonic booms, or contrails. The object created none of these. I found another report that included meteorological data. The pilot had noted that the object was visible against a cloud layer approximately 10,000 feet below the aircraft. The clouds showed no disturbance, despite the object hovering directly above them for nearly 12 minutes, when the object departed, accelerating downward and then angling away horizontally. The clouds remained undisturbed. No exhaust wash, no pressure wave, no atmospheric displacement. Whatever propulsion system these objects used, it didn't interact with air the way conventional engines did. As I compiled my notes, a picture emerged. These objects demonstrated capabilities that suggested propulsion without visible exhaust or conventional engines, acceleration rates far beyond human tolerance or material limits, altitude transitions that should have been aerodynamically impossible, position holding in extreme winds with no visible control surfaces, no sonic booms despite supersonic acceleration, no heat signatures despite energy requirements that should have been enormous. The more I read, the more consistent the pattern became. These were not weather balloons drifting on air currents, not drones operating within the limits of commercial technology, not experimental aircraft testing classified, but conventional propulsion systems, not satellites or space debris creating optical illusions. The objects defied conventional aerodynamics. They ignored wind resistance. They accelerated without visible engines. They operated at altitudes and speeds that should have been impossible for any craft we had the technology to build. And every single report had been filtered out of the investigation pipeline because they lacked radar confirmation. I began to understand why the filter existed. The system was working exactly as designed. It was filtering out anything that couldn't be objectively verified through multiple sensor systems. Pilot testimony alone, no matter how credible, was considered insufficient for triggering formal investigation. The logic was defensible. Pilots make mistakes. Visual observation is unreliable. Memory is fallible. Human perception can be deceived by atmospheric conditions, fatigue, expectation, and dozens of other factors. So the system required corroboration, radar confirmation, multiple independent witnesses with no possibility of coordination, physical evidence, quantifiable data. But here's what troubled me. If something was advanced enough to avoid radar detection deliberately, our entire reporting infrastructure would be blind to it. If an intelligence, human or otherwise, wanted to operate in our airspace without triggering investigation, all they would need to do is avoid generating the specific signatures our system required for escalation. Stay out of radar range. Don't threaten aircraft directly. Don't cause measurable damage. Don't create physical evidence. Do all that, and you could fly through our airspace for decades, being observed and reported by credible witnesses, and never trigger a single formal investigation. The system wasn't designed to hide the truth. It was designed to be efficient, but the result was the same. I pulled one more report from the archive. This one was different. It came from a military transport pilot, not commercial aviation, though it had been transferred through interagency channels and ended up in our database. The report was heavily redacted. Classification markings covered most of the operational details, but the observation section remained intact. The pilot described encountering an object during a nighttime training flight over the Western Pacific. The object appeared on their aircraft's radar briefly, just a single sweep before disappearing. The pilot executed a turn to investigate and achieved visual contact. The object was described as structured, not just a light source. The pilot could discern a shape, though details were difficult to determine in darkness. The shape was roughly circular or disc-like. It demonstrated controlled movement, matching the aircraft's turn for approximately 30 seconds before accelerating away. What struck me was a single line in the report. Object demonstrated awareness of our presence and responded to our approach with immediate departure. Behavior suggested deliberate avoidance of close encounter. The object didn't just move randomly, it responded. It reacted to being observed. That suggested something more disturbing than unusual atmospheric phenomena or misidentified conventional aircraft. It suggested intelligence, purpose, intent. And if these objects were controlled by some intelligence, human or otherwise, then the pattern made sense. They appeared where they could be observed. They maintained distance to avoid direct threat. They demonstrated capabilities that would be documented but not investigated. They departed before generating the kind of evidence that would force a response. They were operating just below the threshold of undeniability, and they had been doing it for years. Chapter 3. The camera that should not have worked. 2 weeks after I started reviewing the pattern, a new report came in that changed everything. Flight 815, Los Angeles to Tokyo, approximately 9 hours into the flight. Same Pacific corridor where most of the sightings occurred, same type of observation, but this time there was footage. The report arrived on a Friday afternoon. I was at my desk reviewing a backlog of routine maintenance flags when the notification appeared. I opened it expecting another standard observation report that would be filed and forgotten. The captain's report explained that their aircraft was equipped with an auxiliary external camera system, a recent addition that several airlines had begun installing for promotional footage and maintenance inspection. The camera was mounted on the underside of the fuselage, capable of being remotely aimed by the flight crew from the cockpit controls. When the object appeared off their starboard side at approximately 2 a.m. local time, the first officer had the presence of mind to activate the camera system and aim it toward the phenomenon. He captured approximately 4 minutes of footage before the object departed. The footage was included in the report as a digital file, compressed but high resolution. I downloaded it immediately, my hands actually shaking slightly as I clicked through the security prompts. In all the reports I had reviewed, in all the documented encounters, this was the first time anyone had managed to capture video evidence. I opened the file with low expectations. Night footage from an aircraft camera is notoriously unreliable. Low light conditions, vibration from the aircraft, compression artifacts from the recording system, distance and atmospheric distortion. Any or all of these factors usually render such footage worthless for serious analysis. Commercial aviation cameras are not designed for capturing distant objects. They're designed for close-range inspection of landing gear and engine components. The lens systems are optimized for clarity at short distances, not for astronomical observation. But this was different. The footage opened with black screen for the first few seconds, the camera repositioning. Then the frame stabilized, showing the view from beneath the aircraft. The ocean far below was invisible in the darkness. Stars were visible across the upper portion of the frame. And then, approximately 1/3 of the way into the frame, there it was. The object appeared as a bright light source, significantly brighter than the stars around it. Not blinding, the camera's automatic exposure compensation was functioning, but distinctly visible. It maintained a consistent brightness across all frames. No flickering, no pulsing, just steady, constant luminosity. What immediately caught my attention was its position. In the first frame where it appeared clearly, it was near the right edge of the screen. But as the footage continued, despite the aircraft travelling at approximately 500 knots, the object maintained a fixed position in the frame. I checked the metadata. The camera wasn't tracking. It was fixed in position relative to the aircraft body. The object was moving with the aircraft. Or more precisely, it was compensating for the aircraft's movement in real time, maintaining perfect relative position. I watched the footage 3 times in succession. The stars in the background showed normal parallax movement as the aircraft travelled. You could see them slowly shifting position across the frame, exactly as you would expect when viewing the sky from a moving platform. The object didn't move at all. It held perfect position, frame after frame, for the entire 4 minutes of footage. But what truly disturbed me wasn't the object itself. It was everything around it. I paused the footage on a frame where the object was clearly visible and began examining the surrounding area. The stars near the edges of the frame appeared normal, sharp points of light against the black background. But the stars closer to the object showed something strange: distortion, stretching, displacement. It was subtle. If I hadn't been looking for it, I might have dismissed it as lens aberration or atmospheric effect. But the pattern was too consistent. Stars visible within approximately 10 degrees of the object's position appeared elongated, as if the light was being bent around something. The effect was reminiscent of gravitational lensing, the way massive objects in space bend light from stars behind them. But gravitational lensing requires enormous mass: planets, stars, black holes. Nothing small enough to be captured in an aircraft camera frame could generate that kind of effect, unless the object was manipulating space itself, warping it somehow, creating a localized field strong enough to bend light but not strong enough to affect the aircraft or the surrounding atmosphere. I felt a chill run through me as I considered the implications. I ran the file through every verification protocol available to me. The digital forensic software checked for signs of a manipulation, frame-by-frame analysis looking for editing artifacts, metadata examination to verify file creation, timestamp and camera settings, compression algorithm analysis to detect if the file had been modified after creation. Everything came back clean. No signs of digital manipulation, no evidence of editing, no inserted frames or altered pixels. The metadata matched perfectly with the aircraft's flight data recorder logs. The timestamp corresponded exactly to the time the captain had reported the incident. The camera settings were consistent throughout the footage. Exposure, white balance, focus depth, all the automatic parameters remained stable, showing the camera was functioning normally. I even checked for lens flare patterns, internal reflections, or other optical artifacts that might explain what I was seeing. But the object didn't behave like any reflection I had ever analysed. Reflections move when the light source or reflecting surface changes position. This stayed fixed. Reflections create predictable patterns based on lens geometry. This created distortion effects that suggested the object itself was warping the space around it. The footage was authentic. Whatever the camera had captured was really there, external to the aircraft, physically present in the airspace. I spent hours going through it frame by frame. The object maintained the same apparent size throughout, suggesting it was holding constant distance from the aircraft. At one point, roughly 2 minutes into the footage, the aircraft passed through a thin layer of high-altitude cirrus clouds. The object remained visible through the clouds, its luminosity undiminished. Then, in the final 30 seconds of footage, something changed. The object's brightness increased slightly. The distortion effect around it intensified. And then, over the course of perhaps 5 frames, less than 1 second of real time, it accelerated upward and disappeared from the frame. The acceleration was so rapid that there was almost no motion blur. 1 frame it was there, 5 frames later it was gone. The speed required for that kind of movement would have been extraordinary. I replayed those final seconds repeatedly. Each time I noticed something new. The stars that had been distorted near the object returned to normal immediately after it departed. The effect didn't linger or fade gradually. It simply ceased, as if the field causing the distortion had been switched off instantly. I compiled a preliminary analysis, frame count, estimated object size based on camera field of view and reported distance, analysis of the distortion pattern, verification of authenticity, comparison with known optical phenomena and aircraft equipment anomalies. My conclusion was simple. The footage showed an unidentified object displaying characteristics inconsistent with any known aircraft, natural phenomenon, or optical artifact. The object demonstrated controlled movement, maintained position relative to a moving aircraft for an extended period, and generated observable spatial distortion effects, suggesting an unknown propulsion or field generation mechanism. I recommended immediate escalation to the technical investigation team. This wasn't just another pilot report that could be dismissed. This was physical evidence, documented proof that something extraordinary was operating in our airspace. I submitted the analysis on Monday morning. The response came back that afternoon. Insufficient radar correlation, unable to verify object is external to aircraft. Possible reflection or lens artifact. Low priority classification maintained. No further action required. I stared at the response in disbelief. I had spent the entire weekend analysing the footage. I had verified its authenticity through every method available. I had documented the distortion effects that clearly showed the object was external to the aircraft. I had eliminated every conventional explanation, and the response was automated. I could tell by the phrasing. The decision hadn't been made by a human analyst. It had been generated by the same classification algorithm that had been dismissing these reports for years. The system had a rule: no radar correlation meant no escalation. The footage didn't matter. The distortion effects didn't matter. The careful analysis didn't matter. The algorithm saw no radar data and stopped processing. I considered appealing the decision. There was a formal process for that, but I had seen enough appeals to know how they ended. Rejected due to insufficient evidence, rejected due to lack of threat, rejected because the guidelines didn't allow for escalation based on visual evidence alone. The footage was placed in the archive, attached to the incident report, classified as low priority. A few people in my department asked about it. They'd heard I was working on something unusual. I showed them the footage. They were impressed, intrigued. But when they learned it had been classified as low priority, they moved on. The system had made its decision. There was nothing more to be done. Over the following weeks, I checked the access logs for the file. I wanted to know if anyone else would review it, if someone higher in the chain would see what I had seen and reach the same conclusions. 3 people accessed the file in the first month. 2 of them were technical staff checking the metadata as part of routine database maintenance. The third was a researcher doing a statistical study on report classifications. None of them watched more than 30 seconds of the footage before moving on. The camera had captured something extraordinary, something that should have triggered immediate investigation and analysis by the highest levels of aviation safety and national security infrastructure. Instead, it was filed, archived, added to a database that would be searched only by people who already knew what they were looking for. The truth was documented. The evidence existed, but it existed in a place where nobody would ever see it. Nobody except me, and a handful of pilots who knew they had witnessed something impossible and would never be believed. Chapter 4. The pattern across years. I couldn't let it go. The footage had proven something fundamental. These incidents were real. They involved physical objects operating in our airspace, objects that displayed technology far beyond our current capabilities, objects that were being consistently observed, documented, and ignored. I needed to understand the full scope of what was happening. I expanded my search parameters significantly. Instead of limiting my review to commercial aviation over the Pacific, I searched for any reports matching the key behavioral characteristics: stationary hover, rapid acceleration, vertical departure, high altitude, no radar confirmation. I also broadened the search geographically: all oceans, all remote flight corridors, any location where commercial or military aviation operated in regions with limited ground-based radar coverage. The search took 4 days to compile. The database wasn't designed for this kind of comprehensive pattern analysis. I had to export data in batches, merge multiple search results, eliminate duplicates, cross-reference incident numbers with archived reports. I worked late every night that week. I told my colleagues I was doing a training exercise, learning the advanced search functions. Nobody questioned it. Most of my co-workers were happy to leave promptly at 5. The idea of voluntarily staying late to explore database features was so foreign to them that they didn't even ask what I was researching. When the final search results compiled, I sat staring at my screen for a long time. 63 reports over 12 years. Not just Pacific routes, Atlantic crossings, Indian Ocean corridors, remote paths over northern Canada, Siberia, the Arctic Circle, flight routes over the southern Pacific near Antarctica, paths across the Mediterranean where it widened beyond land-based radar coverage, always over water or sparsely populated areas, always at high altitude, always during night flights or in conditions of limited visibility. The reports came from commercial pilots, cargo operators, and a handful of military aviators whose reports had been transferred through interagency channels after being initially filed with their command structures. I began analysing the data systematically. First, I mapped the geographic distribution. I exported the location coordinates and plotted them on a world map using basic mapping software. The results showed a clear pattern. The sightings clustered along major aviation corridors that passed over large expanses of water or wilderness. The Pacific routes between North America and Asia. The Atlantic routes between North America and Europe. The southern routes crossing the Indian Ocean between Africa and Australia. No sightings over continental United States. None over Central Europe. None over China or India or any densely populated region. The objects were deliberately choosing locations where observation was possible, but population density was minimal. Next, I analysed the altitude data. Every report that included specific altitude information showed the same range, 30,000 to 45,000 feet. This is the standard cruising altitude for commercial jets. Below 30,000 feet, air traffic is denser and radar coverage is better. Above 45,000 feet, few commercial aircraft operate. The objects were appearing exactly where commercial aircraft spent most of their time, but only in regions where radar coverage was sporadic or non-existent. I examined the duration of each sighting. The mean observation time was approximately 9 minutes. The shortest report described an observation of 3 minutes. The longest detailed a sighting that lasted 22 minutes, long enough to be documented, long enough for pilots to rule out conventional explanations, but not so long that the object became a persistent aviation hazard requiring immediate response. The disappearance patterns were remarkably consistent. In 47 of the 63 reports, the object departed by accelerating upward, climbing nearly vertically at speeds described as extremely rapid or impossible to track. In 12 reports, the object accelerated horizontally, departing so quickly that pilots lost visual contact within seconds. In 4 reports, the object simply vanished, present in one moment, gone in the next, with no visible departure trajectory. Not a single report described the object descending or landing. They all left by moving upward or outward, away from the aircraft, away from the planet's surface. I created a timeline showing the frequency of incidents over the 12-year period. The early years showed fewer reports, 3 to 5 per year, but the frequency increased steadily. By 2006, there were 11 reports in a single year. 2007, the most recent year in my dataset, had already recorded 8 incidents, and we were only in October. The pattern was escalating. Either the objects were appearing more frequently, or pilots were becoming more willing to report their observations, or both. I dug deeper into the reports themselves, reading each one multiple times, taking detailed notes. One pattern I noticed: many of the reports included specific technical language. Pilots weren't just saying, "It moved fast." They were estimating acceleration rates, calculating angular velocities, describing the object's behavior in precise aviation terminology. A cargo pilot flying the North Atlantic route had written, "Object maintained station keeping relative to our aircraft for 7 minutes. Estimated distance 3 to 5 nautical miles at bearing 045 degrees. Object altitude appeared consistent with ours at flight level 380. Upon departure, object executed vertical ascent at acceleration rate exceeding 20 times gravitational force. Estimate based on visual tracking time to horizon limit." This wasn't casual observation. This was professional analysis from someone trained to assess aircraft performance and flight characteristics. Another pilot, flying a route from Dubai to Singapore, had included wind data in his report. Prevailing winds at altitude 115 knots from heading 270. Object maintained fixed position relative to ground reference points for duration of observation, approximately 11 minutes. No visible means of propulsion or stabilization. Departure acceleration estimated at Mach 5+, based on shock pattern visible in atmospheric moisture. The pilot had observed a shock wave. He had seen atmospheric effects consistent with supersonic or hypersonic acceleration, and he had included this detail in his report, knowing it would sound extraordinary. These pilots weren't making casual observations, they were conducting detailed technical analysis because they understood the significance of what they were witnessing. I found 3 reports that mentioned effects on aircraft systems, though these effects were always described as minor and temporary. In one case, the compass showed erratic readings for approximately 60 seconds, while the object was at close range. In another, the GPS signal degraded slightly, showing position accuracy reduced from standard 5-meter precision to approximately 50-meter precision. In a third case, radio communication experienced brief static interference. None of these effects created serious problems. They didn't threaten flight safety, but they suggested the objects generated some kind of electromagnetic field or radiation strong enough to interfere with sensitive equipment at ranges of several miles. What struck me most was what the reports didn't contain. No pilot ever described feeling threatened. No one reported the object approaching aggressively or attempting to intercept their aircraft. No one witnessed hostile actions or dangerous maneuvers that put the aircraft at risk. The objects maintained distance, they observed, and they departed when observation was complete. This wasn't reconnaissance for attack. This wasn't testing defensive responses. This was something else entirely. I created a database separate from the official system. I exported all 63 reports and their associated data. I added my analysis notes. I included the video footage from Flight 815. I created cross-reference indices showing the relationships between incidents. Then I began looking for reports that might have been excluded from my search parameters. I found 11 additional incidents that had been classified differently but showed similar characteristics. 3 had been filed as equipment malfunction because the pilots mentioned compass or GPS anomalies. 5 had been classified as atmospheric phenomenon because the observations occurred during periods of unusual weather. 3 had been classified as satellite observation because the objects were initially thought to be spacecraft or orbital debris. But when I read these reports carefully, they all described the same type of encounter. Object at high altitude, unusual flight characteristics, rapid departure, no radar confirmation. The total was now 74 incidents, 74 documented encounters, with objects displaying impossible flight performance, 74 reports filed by credible witnesses, 74 pieces of evidence that had been systematically distributed across different classification categories, preventing anyone from seeing the pattern unless they deliberately searched for it. The system had done its job perfectly. It had sorted the data, categorized the information, filed everything according to established protocols, and in doing so, it had hidden the truth in plain sight. I saved all my analysis to an encrypted drive. I made backup copies. I prepared summary documents, highlighting the key findings. Then I made an appointment to meet with my supervisor. It was time someone in authority understood what I had discovered. Chapter 5. The Internal Rule. I brought my findings to my supervisor in early November of 2007. I had spent 2 weeks preparing the presentation. Charts showing the distribution of incidents across regions and years, analysis of the common behavioural characteristics, geographic maps with incident locations marked, timeline graphs showing the increasing frequency, links to the original reports, the camera footage from Flight 815. Statistical analysis demonstrating the pattern was far beyond random chance. I requested a meeting through the formal channels. My supervisor, Catherine Morrison, was a 20-year veteran of the aviation safety industry. She had worked her way up from field investigator to regional coordinator to her current position overseeing data analysis for the entire Western region. She was pragmatic, detail-oriented, and, I had always believed, genuinely committed to aviation safety. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. I arrived early, set up my laptop, and waited. Catherine arrived exactly on time. She sat down across from me, placed a notepad on the table, and folded her hands. "You said this was important," she said. "I've got 30 minutes before my next meeting, so let's see what you have." I started the presentation. I walked her through the search methodology, explained how I had identified the pattern, showed her the geographic distribution data, presented the timeline showing escalating frequency, highlighted the consistency in behavioural characteristics, the hovering, the acceleration, the vertical departures. She listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes. I showed her specific reports, let her read the technical language pilots had used, the careful descriptions, the professional analysis. Then I played the video footage. The room was quiet except for the sound of my laptop fan. We watched the 4 minutes of footage together. I paused it several times to point out the distortion effects around the object, the way it maintained perfect position relative to the moving aircraft, the rapid departure at the end. When the footage ended, Catherine sat back in her chair. "This is good work," she said slowly. "Thorough, well documented." I felt a surge of hope. "But," she continued, and my heart sank. "There's always a but. But you need to understand something about how this system operates, about why it operates the way it does." She opened her notepad and began sketching a simple diagram. 3 circles, partially overlapping. "Aviation safety," she said, tapping the first circle. "National security," tapping the second. "Public welfare," tapping the third. "These are our priorities. Everything we do is evaluated against these 3 concerns." She drew an X outside all 3 circles. "Incidents without measurable threat," she said, pointing to the X. "That's what you found." "Unusual, yes. Unexplained, absolutely. But threatening? No evidence of that." "But the objects," I started. She held up a hand. "Let me finish. I'm going to tell you something that isn't written in any manual or policy document. It's an operational reality that everyone in our position eventually learns." She leaned forward. Incidents without measurable threat are not pursued, not because we don't care, not because we're hiding anything, but because response creates risk. I don't understand, I said. Think about what would happen if we escalated this, Catherine explained. If we treated these sightings as serious incidents requiring investigation, we'd have to brief our superiors, they'd have to brief their superiors. Eventually, it reaches people who make public statements. The media gets involved. Suddenly we're having a national conversation about UFOs and alien spacecraft. But isn't that appropriate if that's what the evidence suggests? Evidence of what? That pilots occasionally see things they can't explain? We've known that forever. That objects display flight characteristics beyond our current technology? Maybe. Or maybe our understanding of what's possible is incomplete. Or maybe there are classified programs we don't know about. She tapped her notepad. But let's say you're right. Let's say these are genuine unknowns, non-human intelligence, whatever you want to call them. What then? I didn't have an answer. We can't catch them, Catherine continued. They're faster than anything we have. We can't communicate with them. If they wanted to communicate, they would have by now. We can't control where they appear or when they leave. We can't predict their presence. We can't defend against them if they became hostile. She paused, letting that sink in. So what does investigation accomplish? We'd expend enormous resources documenting something we already know is happening. We create public panic over something we have zero ability to address. We'd open ourselves to criticism for not having answers to unanswerable questions. And for what? What would be the actual benefit? The truth, I said quietly. People deserve to know the truth. Catherine smiled, but it wasn't a happy expression. Do they? Let me tell you what would happen. First, there'd be panic. People afraid to fly. Economic impact on aviation industry. Then there'd be demands for action. Military responses, international coordination, emergency measures. Resources diverted from actual threats to address something that, based on your own analysis, has never harmed anyone. But then, she continued, there'd be the conspiracy theories, government cover-up, secret treaties with aliens, underground bases, whatever else people decide to believe. Trust in institutions would collapse. And the objects? They'd keep doing exactly what they're already doing. Appearing, observing, leaving. Nothing would change except the level of fear and dysfunction in our society. She closed her notepad. That's why we don't pursue incidents without measurable threat. Not because we're blind, not because we're incompetent, but because response creates more problems than it solves. Observation creates deniability, and deniability creates stability. I sat in silence for a moment, processing what she had said. So we just look away? No, Catherine said firmly. We document, we file, we maintain records. If something changes, if these objects start interfering with aircraft, if they demonstrate hostile intent, if they create actual risk, then we have all the documentation we need to respond appropriately. But until that happens, we follow protocols, we categorize, we file, and we let the system work as designed. The system is designed to ignore the truth. The system is designed to manage risk, she corrected. And right now, investigation is a bigger risk than observation. That's not my opinion. That's operational reality based on decades of experience. She stood up, indicating the meeting was ending. Your analysis will be acknowledged, she said. It will be added to the internal archive. It will be marked as reviewed. But there will be no further action. Because there's no radar correlation, I said bitterly. Because there's no threat, Catherine replied. The day one of these objects interferes with a commercial airliner in a way that risks passenger safety, everything changes. Until then, we continue doing our jobs, which is triaging information, identifying real threats, and maintaining the safety and stability of the aviation system. She picked up her notepad. "If you want my advice, let this go. You've done good analytical work. That's noted in your file. But pursuing this further won't change anything except possibly derailing your career. People who become obsessed with unexplained phenomena don't advance in this field. They get sidelined, marginalized. Eventually they leave, usually bitter and convinced there's some grand conspiracy." She paused at the door. "There's no conspiracy. Just priorities, just systems, just people doing jobs that require them to focus on what matters most. These incidents, whatever they are, don't meet that threshold." "What if the threshold is wrong?" I asked. Catherine looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Sympathy, resignation, sadness. "Then we'll find out eventually. And all these reports you've compiled will suddenly become very important. But until that day comes, if it ever comes, we follow protocols. We do our jobs. And we trust that the system, imperfect as it is better than the chaos that would result from dismantling it." She left. I sat alone in the conference room for a long time, staring at my presentation slides still displayed on the screen. Everything she had said made sense from an institutional perspective. The logic was sound. The reasoning was pragmatic. The conclusions were defensible. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a profound mistake. That by choosing stability over truth, by prioritizing process over investigation, we were failing some fundamental responsibility to understand what was sharing our skies. But Catherine was right about one thing. I couldn't change the system. Not from my position. Not with the authority I had. I packed up my laptop and returned to my desk. My compiled report was acknowledged the following day. A brief note in my file indicating I had conducted a comprehensive analysis of unusual aviation incidents. No mention of my conclusions, no reference to the pattern I had discovered. Just an acknowledgement that I had done work that exceeded my basic job requirements. The note would probably help at my next performance review. It showed initiative and thoroughness. It also ensured that I would never be taken seriously on this subject again. I had become that analyst who was interested in UFOs, a label that, in our professional culture, was equivalent to admitting to poor judgment and borderline obsession with fringe theories. The system continued exactly as before. Reports came in. I processed them. The pattern continued to develop, and I watched, documenting everything, knowing that nobody else would ever connect the pieces I had connected, unless something forced them to look. Chapter 6. The one report that was escalated for 3 months, I stopped searching. I did my job, reviewed reports, applied the filters, watched the pattern continue. Then in February of 2008, something changed. A report came in from a cargo flight over the North Atlantic, military contract route, higher classification than normal commercial traffic, but still processed through our system for coordination purposes. The report followed the now familiar pattern. Object appeared at high altitude, maintained position, demonstrated unusual flight characteristics. But this time there was a difference. The object briefly interfered with the aircraft's navigation systems, not aggressively, not in a way that created immediate danger, but for approximately 40 seconds, the aircraft's GPS signal degraded. The compass showed fluctuating readings. The autopilot disengaged and required manual reactivation. Then the object departed and all systems returned to normal. The interference triggered automatic threat protocols. The report was escalated immediately, not to my supervisor, but past our entire department, directly to a joint review team that handled potential security incidents. I never saw the full analysis. That was above my clearance, but I monitored the incident tracking system and saw the case progress through multiple review stages over the following weeks. Then 6 weeks after the initial report, the status changed to closed, no further action, no explanation, no findings report, no recommendations, just closed. I checked the archive. The original report was still there, but the escalation notes had been removed. The incident was reclassified from navigation system interference to equipment anomaly, cause undetermined. Whatever had been discovered during the investigation, whatever conclusions had been reached, had been buried deeper than anything in my archive. The message was clear. Even when the objects broke the pattern, even when they demonstrated capability that should have triggered serious concern, the response was the same. Document, review, dismiss. Chapter 7. The language shift in the months following the North Atlantic incident. I noticed something strange. The reports kept coming. Same frequency, same locations, same behavioural patterns. But the language changed. Pilots stopped describing the objects themselves. They stopped mentioning shapes, lights, or visual characteristics. Instead, they described effects. Experienced sudden barometric pressure change, inconsistent with atmospheric conditions. Noted temporal distortion in cockpit chronometer readings during visual contact with unexplained phenomenon. Observed optical refraction effects suggesting localized gravitational lensing. The reports became more technical, more clinical, less descriptive. It took me several weeks to understand why. The pilots were adapting to the system. They had learned that reports describing UFOs or unknown aircraft were dismissed. But reports describing measurable physical effects went into different categories. Atmospheric anomalies, equipment irregularities, navigation discrepancies. These categories had different priority thresholds. They generated different automated responses. The pilots weren't changing what they saw. They were changing how they reported it. And in doing so, they were revealing something more disturbing than the objects themselves. The phenomenon was adapting too. Earlier reports described objects that were visible, bright, obviously present. Later reports described distortion effects, pressure changes, time discrepancies, phenomena that were harder to dismiss as misidentification, but also harder to verify objectively. It was as if whatever was being observed understood that visibility led to dismissal, so it shifted toward effects that demanded attention without providing clear evidence. The reports became simultaneously more credible and less actionable. The system adapted by creating new filter categories. The phenomenon adapted by changing its observable characteristics. It was an arms race of documentation, fought entirely in language and classification systems, and the phenomenon was winning. Chapter 8. Why the Sky Stays Quiet. By late 2008, I had reviewed more than 200 related reports spanning 15 years. I had cross-referenced locations, times, altitudes, and observed behaviours. A clear pattern emerged, not just in what was reported, but in what was never reported. The objects never appeared over cities, never over dense air traffic corridors, never during daylight hours over populated areas. They appeared over oceans, over remote wilderness, over regions where observation was possible, but consequence was minimal. They maintained distance from aircraft, never close to threatening proximity, never demonstrated pursuit or aggressive manoeuvring. They avoided confrontation. The implication was staggering. Whatever these objects were, whoever or whatever controlled them, they were not testing our defences. They were not probing for weaknesses. They were not preparing for invasion or attack. They were testing our awareness. They appeared where they could be seen by trained observers, pilots with the experience to distinguish unusual phenomena from normal operations. They demonstrated capabilities that were impossible to dismiss as conventional technology. They maintained visibility long enough to be documented, but they did so in contexts where response was impractical and escalation was unlikely. They were conducting an experiment, and the hypothesis being tested was simple. How much can you see before you choose to look away? The answer, based on 15 years of reports, was clear. We could see everything. We just chose not to. Chapter 9. The File That Vanishes. In December of 2008, I made a decision. I compiled everything. Every report I had reviewed. Every pattern I had identified. The camera footage, the language analysis, the geographic distribution data, the timeline showing the shift in reporting, methods and observable effects. I created a consolidated analysis file. 47 pages. Indexed, cross-referenced, documented with primary sources. The thesis was simple. We are being observed by non-human intelligence, and our institutional response has been systematic dismissal. I submitted it through the formal review channel. Not as a low-priority note, but as a formal analytical report requiring supervisory review and response. The submission confirmation came back immediately. File received, tracking number assigned. Review estimated within 30 days. 3 days later, I tried to access the file. It was gone. Not marked as reviewed, not transferred to another department, not denied or rejected, simply absent from the system. I checked the submission logs. My submission was not listed. I checked the tracking database. The tracking number I had received did not exist. I contacted IT support. They found no record of the file in any system database, no deletion log, no access history, no backup copy. The file had vanished as if it had never existed. I considered resubmitting. I had kept personal copies of everything. I could recreate the report, submit it again, escalate through different channels. But I understood what had happened. This was not active suppression. Nobody had ordered the file deleted. Nobody had rejected my analysis. The system itself had rejected it. Some automated process, some filter I didn't know existed, had identified my submission as outside acceptable parameters and removed it before any human reviewed it. Or perhaps someone had reviewed it. Perhaps that review had lasted 30 seconds, just long enough to understand what I was claiming, and decided that the report could not be allowed to proceed. Either way, the result was the same. The information existed only in archives that nobody searched. The pattern existed only in reports that nobody connected. The truth existed only in the space between what was documented and what was acknowledged. I had discovered the perfect method of concealment. Not lies, not cover-ups, not conspiracy, just process, just filters, just systems doing exactly what they were designed to do. Epilogue. The truth about disclosure. I left the job 6 months later, not because I was forced out. Nobody pressured me to resign. Nobody threatened me. Nobody even acknowledged my consolidated report. I left because I finally understood. Nothing is hidden. Everything is buried under process. The objects are not secret. They are documented. Every encounter is recorded. Every observation is filed. The evidence exists. It just exists in a form that makes it irrelevant. The reports are distributed across agencies, contractors, and databases that don't communicate with each other. The pattern is visible only if you deliberately search for it, which nobody has reason to do. The incidents are individually dismissed before anyone with authority to act ever sees them. The system is not designed to hide the truth. It is designed to handle information efficiently. And efficient handling means filtering out anything that doesn't require immediate action. The objects know this. They operate within the gaps. They appear where they will be documented but not investigated. They demonstrate capabilities that will be reported but not believed. They maintain a presence that is persistent enough to be undeniable, but diffuse enough to be ignored. They are not hiding from us. We are hiding from them, using our own bureaucracy as a shield. The question was never whether they exist. The evidence has been available for decades, filed, sorted and forgotten by people like me who are trained to prioritize other concerns. The question is whether we will ever choose to look at what we have been documenting all along. I don't think we will, because looking requires acknowledging. Acknowledging requires response. Response requires resources and risk, and consequences that extend beyond anything our current systems are prepared to handle. It is easier to keep filing reports, easier to keep dismissing anomalies, easier to let the pattern remain buried under the weight of process. The invasion never came because it never needed to. They were already here, watching, waiting, conducting their careful study of human awareness and institutional blindness. And we provided them with perfect conditions for observation. We documented everything and investigated nothing. We created a system so efficient at handling information that the truth became indistinguishable from noise. And somewhere above the Pacific, above the Atlantic, above the remote corners of our airspace, they continue their survey, appearing, hovering, departing, being seen by people trained to be reliable witnesses, being reported by people following proper procedures, being dismissed by systems designed to ignore anything that doesn't fit predetermined threat models. The files exist, the pattern exists, the truth exists, but it exists in a place where nobody looks. And perhaps that was always the point. Before we begin tonight's story, I want to take just a moment to ask for your support. If you're enjoying what you're hearing, please consider using your hype points on this video. It truly helps the channel grow in ways you might not realize, and every single point makes a difference. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review helps us reach more people who love this kind of content. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing our global community and knowing that someone in Tokyo might be starting their morning while someone in London is winding down their evening. If you enjoy these stories and want to hear more, please consider subscribing. It means everything. Now let's begin. A documentary investigation. The thing about routine is that it makes you vulnerable. When every night looks the same, when every procedure follows the same script, when every mile of airspace feels as familiar as your own driveway, that's when reality finds the cracks to slip through. This is a story about a flight that should have been forgettable, a regional route, a handful of passengers, clear skies, but somewhere between departure and arrival, something happened that still doesn't have an explanation. Not officially anyway. Flight 227 departed on schedule. The aircraft was a standard twin-engine regional jet, the kind that makes the same route 5 days a week without anyone noticing. The crew had flown together dozens of times. The passengers were the usual mix. Business travellers too tired to care, a couple of students heading home, an elderly woman visiting family. 11 people total, including crew. The flight path would take them northeast over mostly rural territory, following a corridor that air traffic control could monitor with minimal intervention. Everything was filed correctly. Everything was normal. Captain Michael Torres had logged over 12,000 hours in his career. His first officer, Amanda Price, was younger but sharp, with 3,000 hours and a reputation for staying calm under pressure. Neither of them expected anything unusual that night. The pre-flight checks revealed nothing out of the ordinary. Fuel was adequate. Weather along the route was clear, with light winds. Visibility was excellent. The kind of night where flying feels less like work and more like meditation. They pushed back from the gate at 2300 hours, exactly. The taxi to the runway was brief. Tower cleared them for takeoff, and the engines spooled up with their familiar whine. The aircraft lifted smoothly into the darkness, wheels retracting with a solid thunk as they climbed through 1,000 feet. Torres banked gently to the northeast, settling into the flight path as Price handled the radio communications. They levelled off at 28,000 feet. Autopilot engaged, everything nominal. In the cabin, most passengers had already closed their eyes or pulled out books and phones. The flight attendant, Marcus Webb, made his way down the aisle, checking seat belts and offering water. The cabin lights were dimmed to encourage rest. The engine noise settled into its steady drone, that white noise that makes conversation difficult and sleep easy. For the first 20 minutes of the flight, nothing whatsoever was remarkable. Chapter 1. The Light Above the Wing. Jessica Holden sat in seat 8A, the window seat on the left side of the aircraft. She wasn't particularly interested in looking outside. At night, there's usually nothing to see but your own reflection and maybe some distant lights on the ground. She had her laptop open, trying to finish a report that was due the next morning, but the cabin lighting was too dim to work comfortably. She glanced out the window, intending to close the shade completely, and that's when she saw it. A light, small at first, but distinct. It wasn't on the ground. It was level with the aircraft, maybe a few hundred feet away, keeping perfect pace with them. She watched it for several seconds, assuming it was another plane, but there were no navigation lights, no red or green wingtip markers, no white strobe, just a steady pale light that seemed almost to glow from within rather than shine outward. She leaned closer to the window. The light maintained its position exactly, as if tethered to their wing. It didn't drift forward or fall back. It didn't rise or sink. It matched their speed with absolute precision. She looked around the cabin to see if anyone else had noticed, but most passengers had their eyes closed or were facing away from the windows. The man across the aisle was asleep, head tilted back, mouth slightly open. Jessica pressed the call button. Marcus appeared a moment later, leaning down with a professional smile. "Everything okay?" "There's something outside," she said quietly, not wanting to alarm anyone. "A light. It's been following us." Marcus glanced past her out the window. His smile faltered slightly. "Probably just another aircraft in the corridor. Sometimes they can look closer than they are at night, "It doesn't have any navigation lights," Jessica said, "and it's matching our speed exactly." Marcus looked again, his expression more serious now. The light was still there, steady and unexplained. "Let me check with the cockpit," he said, keeping his voice calm. He moved forward, picking up the intercom handset near the cockpit door. In the cockpit, Torres and Price were monitoring their instruments with routine efficiency. The autopilot was handling the aircraft beautifully. Their course was true, altitude steady. When Marcus's voice came through the intercom, Torres almost didn't want to answer. Passenger concerns during cruise were usually about temperature or turbulence. "Captain, sorry to disturb you. Passenger in 8A is reporting a light outside her window. Says it's been pacing us. No nav lights visible." Torres exchanged a glance with Price. "We'll take a look," he said. He switched off the autopilot and banked the aircraft very slightly to the left, giving himself a better view out his side window. Price scanned her instruments for any traffic alerts. Nothing registered. No other aircraft within 10 miles according to their collision avoidance system. Torres looked out into the darkness. At first he saw nothing unusual. Stars above, scattered lights far below. Then he saw it. Off the left side, slightly aft of the wing, a pale luminous object keeping perfect station with them. No detail visible, no structure, just light. He stared at it for 5 full seconds. "You seeing this?" he asked Price. She leaned forward, craning her neck to see past him. "What is that?" "Unknown traffic," Torres said, though the words felt inadequate. He checked the radar again. Still nothing. He keyed the radio. "Center, flight 227. We have a visual on unidentified traffic. At our 10 o'clock position, approximately 300 yards, matching our course and speed. Do you have anyone in our vicinity?" The controller's voice came back after a brief pause. "Flight 227, negative. Radar shows no traffic within 15 miles of your position. Can you describe what you're seeing?" Torres hesitated. Describing it accurately felt impossible. "A light source, steady illumination, no visible navigation markers. It's maintaining formation with us." "Copy that, 227. Continue your present heading. Let us know if it maneuvers." Price was still staring at the light. "It's not moving at all," she said quietly. "I mean, it's moving with us, but relative to us, it's completely stationary. That's not easy to do." Torres knew she was right. Maintaining that kind of precision, especially without any visible means of propulsion or control surfaces, wasn't something conventional aircraft could manage easily. Military jets could do it with skilled pilots, but this didn't look like any military aircraft he'd ever seen. And why would a military jet pace a civilian, regional flight with its lights off? In the cabin, other passengers were starting to notice. A businessman, in seat 5B, leaned across the empty middle seat to look out the window. A college student 3 rows back pulled out her phone and tried to take a picture, but the reflection on the window and the darkness outside made it impossible to capture anything useful. Marcus moved through the cabin, trying to reassure people without really having any information to offer. "The pilots are aware of it," he told them calmly. "They're in contact with air traffic control. Everything is under control." But privately, Marcus felt uneasy. The light wasn't behaving like anything he'd seen in 8 years of flying. It didn't blink. It didn't move. It just existed there in the darkness, as if it had always been there and always would be. Chapter 2. Instruments begin to lie. Price was it, the first to notice the altitude discrepancy. She glanced at her primary flight display and saw they were indicating 28,200 feet. She looked at the standby altimeter. 28,000 feet exactly. She tapped the glass on the standby instrument out of habit, even though it was digital and tapping did nothing. The reading didn't change. "Michael," she said, "I'm showing a slight difference between primary and standby altitude." Torres checked his own instruments. His primary display agreed with Price's standby. Which one's right? I don't know, Price admitted. Could be a static port issue, but we're not getting any warnings. They watched for another minute. The altitude readings slowly drifted back into agreement, as if the instruments had been arguing and decided to compromise. Torres made a note on his kneeboard. Probably nothing, but worth documenting. Then the heading started to wander, just a degree or two. The autopilot corrected it smoothly, bringing them back to their programmed course. Then it drifted again, corrected again. It was subtle enough that Torres almost dismissed it as normal atmospheric interference, except the night was completely calm. No turbulence, no wind shear, nothing that should cause heading deviations. We're getting little corrections, Price said, her fingers hovering over the autopilot disconnect button. It's like something's pushing us slightly off course and the autopilot is compensating. Torres was about to respond when he noticed the clock. The digital chronometer on his instrument panel read 23:47. His wristwatch, which he'd synchronized before the flight, read 23:49. A 2-minute difference that hadn't been there during takeoff. He held up his wrist to show Price. Your watch matched the panel clock, he asked. Price checked her own watch. It agreed with Torres's. They both looked at the panel clock, which now read 23:48, as if it had jumped forward a minute in the time it took them to check their watches. That's not right, Price said quietly. In the cabin, Jessica Holden had noticed something strange as well. Her phone, which she'd glanced at when she first saw the light, had read 23:39. She looked at it again now. 23:52. She tried to calculate how long she'd been watching the light. 10 minutes? 15? It felt like 5, but 13 minutes had passed according to her phone. She rubbed her eyes, wondering if she was more tired than she'd realised. The man across the aisle, now awake, checked his own watch and frowned. He was certain he'd only dozed for a few minutes, but his watch suggested he'd been asleep for nearly half an hour. He shook his head and closed his eyes again, assuming his internal clock was just off. Marcus stood in the galley area, holding a cup of coffee he'd poured for himself. The coffee was cold. He'd just poured it, he was certain of that, but it was stone cold, as if it had been sitting for 20 minutes. He dumped it in the small sink and stared at the empty cup, trying to understand what was happening. Back in the cockpit, Torres and Price were running through their system checks more thoroughly now. Every major system reported normal. Engines were operating within parameters. Fuel consumption was exactly as predicted. Electrical systems nominal. Hydraulics good. Pressurization holding steady. But the small anomalies kept appearing and disappearing, like glitches in a simulation that was almost perfect, but not quite. The navigation display showed them precisely on course, but when Torres cross-referenced their position using the backup GPS receiver, there was a slight discrepancy. Not enough to be alarming, just enough to be noticeable. A few 100 feet difference in their reported position, and the difference kept shifting, as if they were in two places at once, and the instruments couldn't decide which one was real. Center, Flight 227, Torres called. We're experiencing some minor instrument anomalies. Nothing critical, but we're seeing small disagreements between our systems. Can you confirm our position and altitude? The controller's response came back with a slight edge of concern. Flight 227, we show you at 28,000 feet, 73 miles northeast of your departure point. Tracking is filed. Everything looks normal from here. Torres and Price exchanged glances. 73 miles. They calculated quickly. They should be at least 80 miles out by now, maybe more. The controller was showing them 7 miles behind where they should be. But their own instruments suggested they were on schedule, maybe even slightly ahead. Price pulled up the flight management system page, showing their estimated time to the next waypoint. The calculation seemed to flicker between two different times, as if the computer couldn't quite commit to an answer. She stared at the screen, watching the numbers waver like a mirage. "Something's wrong with time," she said aloud, not quite believing her own words. Torres looked at her. He wanted to dismiss it, to find a rational explanation. Instrument malfunction, software glitch, but he'd been flying long enough to trust his instincts, and his instincts were telling him that Price was right. Time itself felt wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not like they'd jumped hours or days, just slightly wrong. Stretched in some places, compressed in others, like the universe was having trouble deciding how fast their clocks should run. The light outside the window remained constant, unwavering, patient, as if it was waiting for them to notice something important. In the cabin, a few passengers had started to feel strange. Not sick exactly, not frightened, just disconnected, as if they were watching themselves from slightly outside their own bodies. The elderly woman in seat 3C felt like she was sitting in a memory of a plane rather than an actual plane. Everything was real, but it also felt like a well-constructed copy of reality rather than reality itself. The college student who tried to take a photo found herself staring at her phone screen without really seeing it. Her thumb scrolled through social media posts, but she wasn't reading them. Her mind felt distant, observing her actions from somewhere else. She shook her head, trying to clear the fog, but it persisted like a gentle pressure on her consciousness. Marcus moved through the cabin one more time, checking on passengers. Most seemed fine, if a bit drowsy, but there was something in their expressions that troubled him. A kind of distant look, as if they were all sharing the same dream, and hadn't quite realised they were dreaming. He returned to the galley and looked out the small window. The light was still there. Closer now, he thought, though it was hard to be certain. It seemed to have moved from a position beside the wing to a position slightly above and behind the cockpit, not dramatically, just a subtle shift in location, as if it was examining the aircraft from different angles. Torres had noticed the movement too. He'd been watching the light in his peripheral vision, and it was definitely changing position relative to the aircraft. Not quickly, not threateningly, just methodically, as if conducting an inspection. He tried the radio again. Center 227. The unidentified traffic has changed position. Now behind and above us. Still no radar contact on our end. Copy 227. We still show nothing in your vicinity. Are you requesting priority handling? Torres considered the question. Priority handling meant declaring an emergency, or at least an unusual situation. It would bring more scrutiny, questions, reports. But what would he say? That a light was following them and his clocks were running strangely? That didn't sound like an emergency. It sounded like something he'd be embarrassed to explain to investigators later. Negative center, continuing as filed. Will advise if situation changes. Roger, 227. We'll keep monitoring. Price was gripping the control yoke now. Even though the autopilot was engaged, her knuckles were white. Michael, I think we should consider diverting. Something's not right here. Torres nodded slowly. She was right. But divert to where? And based on what exactly? A light following them? Instruments that disagreed slightly? A feeling that time was wrong? He'd made thousands of decisions in his career, but this one felt impossible. Every option seemed wrong. Let's see what happens at the next waypoint, he said finally. If things get worse, we divert immediately. Deal? Price nodded reluctantly. The next waypoint was 8 minutes away according to the flight plan. Or 10 minutes, or 6. The instruments couldn't quite agree. Chapter 3. The object moves closer. The shift was so gradual that no one could pinpoint exactly when it happened. The light that had been pacing them, that had moved from beside the wing to above and behind, was now directly overhead. Not far overhead, close, uncomfortably close, so close that its glow was beginning to illuminate the top of the fuselage with a pale, cold light that wasn't quite white and wasn't quite blue. Jessica Holden could see the reflection of it now on the wing, a diffuse luminescence that moved across the metal surface like moonlight through water. She pressed her face to the window, trying to see upward, but the angle was wrong. All she could see was the glow and the way it made the wing look strange and unfamiliar, as if she was seeing it for the first time. In the cockpit, both pilots could feel it, not see it, feel it, a presence directly above them, so close that it seemed impossible they weren't colliding with it. Torres glanced up at the overhead panel, half expecting to see the ceiling deforming under weight or pressure, but everything looked normal. The panel lights glowed their usual colours, the switches were in their proper positions, yet the feeling persisted. Price checked the radar altimeter, an instrument that measures height above the ground by bouncing radio waves downward. She wasn't sure why she checked it. They were nearly 6 miles above the Earth, but the reading caught her attention. The altimeter showed their height above ground, but it was flickering. Brief spikes appeared in the data, as if something above them was occasionally blocking or interfering with the signal to the ground. That should have been impossible. The radar beam travels downward, not up. "Are you seeing this?" she asked Torres, pointing at the instrument. He leaned over to look. The spikes were unmistakable. Something was interfering with their radar altimeter. Something between them and the ground. Or rather, something above them that was somehow affecting the downward travelling beam. The physics didn't make sense, but the evidence was right there on the screen. Then the pressure changes began. Subtle at first, a slight compression feeling in the ears, as if the cabin altitude was changing. But the pressurization system showed normal. The cabin was holding at its programmed altitude, equivalent of 6,000 feet. The outflow valves were operating correctly. There was no reason anyone should feel pressure changes. Yet several passengers were swallowing and working their jaws, trying to equalize pressure that shouldn't exist. The businessman in 5B pinched his nose and blew gently, feeling his ears pop even though the cabin pressure hadn't actually changed. Marcus felt it too, a strange compression that reminded him of descending through thick weather, even though they were level at altitude in clear air. Then the engine anomaly occurred. The left engine's N1 tachometer, which measures the speed of the engine's fan, showed a momentary decrease, not a dramatic drop, just a slight spool down, as if the engine had temporarily lost power. Torres's hand moved instinctively toward the throttles, but before he could touch them, the engine came back up to normal speed. The whole event lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Price was already scanning the engine instruments. Oil pressure normal, temperature normal, fuel flow normal, vibration levels normal. Everything looked fine. But they'd both felt the slight yaw as the thrust decreased on one side and then returned. The autopilot had corrected for it so smoothly that most passengers probably hadn't noticed, but it had definitely happened. "Did we just have an engine surge?" Price asked. "Looked more like it spooled down and then recovered," Torres said. "But all the parameters are good." They watched the instruments intensely for any sign of repeat behaviour. The engines ran smoothly, their steady vibration transmitted through the airframe. Whatever had happened seemed to have passed, but it added one more item to the growing list of things that shouldn't be happening, but were. Above them, unseen but undeniably present, the object maintained its position. Passengers who were awake and aware enough to process what was happening began to realise that the light wasn't just following them anymore. It was examining them. The way it moved from position to position, the way it seemed to pause and observe from different angles, suggested intention, purpose, intelligence. Jessica had her laptop closed now, report forgotten. She was taking notes by hand in a small notebook she'd pulled from her bag. She wrote down times, observations, anything that might help her remember this accurately later. She had a feeling that memory was going to be unreliable, that this experience might fade or distort, and she wanted a concrete record written in real time. The student 3 rows back had given up trying to take photos. Her phone camera couldn't capture what her eyes were seeing anyway. Instead, she sat very still, hands folded in her lap, watching the play of light on the wing and feeling something she couldn't quite name. Not fear, not awe, something between the two. A sense of being observed by something that understood aircraft better than she did, better than the pilots did, better than the engineers who designed it. The object's presence became more pronounced. It wasn't getting brighter, but its effect on the aircraft was intensifying. Small vibrations moved through the structure, barely perceptible, but definitely there. Not turbulence, not engine vibration, something else. A resonance, as if the object was somehow matching the aircraft's frequency and creating a harmonic effect. Torres felt it through the control yoke, a subtle buzz that wasn't there before. He disengaged the autopilot to get a better sense of the aircraft's behaviour. The controls felt slightly different, not sluggish, not unresponsive, just different. As if the air around the aircraft had changed density, or the control surfaces were moving. Through a slightly different medium, he re-engaged the autopilot after a few seconds. Everything was controllable. The aircraft was flying fine, but the wrongness was increasing. Every system said they were operating normally, yet nothing felt normal at all. "I think we should tell the passengers something," Price said quietly. Torres nodded. She was right. People were noticing. Better to acknowledge it than let fear build in silence. He picked up the public address microphone, considering his words carefully. "What do you say?" "That an unexplained object is pacing your aircraft and causing strange effects. That your instruments are lying and time doesn't feel right. That you don't know what's happening, but you're handling it." He pressed the button. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Torres. You may have noticed some unusual lighting effects outside the aircraft. We're experiencing the presence of an unidentified object in our vicinity. Air traffic control is aware of the situation. The aircraft is operating normally, and we're continuing to our destination. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll keep you informed of any developments." He released the button. Price looked at him. "That's probably the strangest announcement I've ever heard a captain make." "Strange situation," Torres replied. In the cabin, the announcement had mixed effects. Some passengers felt reassured that the pilots acknowledged what was happening. Others felt more anxious now, that it was confirmed. The elderly woman in 3C simply nodded to herself, as if she'd expected something like this eventually. The businessman looked around nervously, as if checking whether anyone else was as concerned as he was. Marcus stood near the forward galley, watching the passengers and watching the light through the small window. He'd been trained for medical emergencies, for turbulence, for evacuations and depressurizations. But nothing in his training covered this. He gripped the edge of the counter, feeling the strange vibration through his hands, and wondered what would happen next. Chapter 4. The Silence. The radios died at precisely 0014. Price was in the middle of a routine position report when her voice simply stopped transmitting. She released the button and pressed it again. Nothing. She checked the radio panel. Everything showed normal. Power indicators lit. Frequency selected correctly. But when she spoke, her voice went nowhere. Torres tried his own radio. Same result. The equipment appeared functional, but no sound was getting out. Or more accurately, no sound was getting through. He switched frequencies, trying the emergency channel, then the company frequency, then back to air traffic control. Each time, silence. Not static, not interference, just silence. An absence so complete it felt like the radio waves themselves had stopped existing. "Center, this is Flight 227, do you read?" Price tried again. Nothing. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Flight 227 experiencing complete radio failure." The words went nowhere. They switched to the backup radio. Same result. Torres pulled out the emergency transponder codes. He set the transponder to 7600, the code for radio failure. At least air traffic control would see that on their screen and know they'd lost communication. But even that felt useless. If the radios weren't working, was the transponder signal getting through either? The silence in the cockpits became oppressive. Without the occasional radio chatter from air traffic control, without the background noise of other flights checking in on frequency, the cockpit felt isolated, cut off. Torres realized he'd grown accustomed to that constant low-level communication. It was proof that other people existed, that they were part of a larger system. Now that system was gone. Price tried the satellite phone as a last resort. Some regional jets had them for emergencies. She pulled it from its cradle and powered it on. The display lit up. Signal strength showed good. She dialed the company operations center. The phone indicated it was connecting. Then nothing. No ringtone, no answer. Just a silent connection to nowhere. She hung up and tried again. Same result. The phone worked. The signal existed. But nothing was on the other end. Or rather, something was preventing the other end from receiving. "It's blocking communications," she said quietly. "All of them." Torres knew she was right. The object above them wasn't just passively observing anymore. It was actively preventing them from contacting anyone outside the aircraft. That shift from passive to active felt significant, threatening even. Though nothing overtly hostile had occurred, the isolation was its own form of threat. He looked at the clock. 00:15. Or was it? His watch said 00:18. The cabin clock showed 00:16. 3 different times from 3 different sources, none of them agreeing, all of them potentially wrong. Time had become completely unreliable. In the cabin, several passengers had noticed their phones weren't working properly. No signal, no data connection. Text messages queued but wouldn't send. The businessman tried to call his office to let them know he might be late, but the call failed immediately. He tried again. Same result. He looked around and saw other passengers staring at their phones with similar frustrated expressions. Marcus made his way down the aisle, trying to project calm. "We're experiencing some communication difficulties," he told anyone who made eye contact. "Nothing to be concerned about. The pilots are handling it." But privately, he was deeply concerned. Complete communication failure wasn't something that just happened on modern aircraft. These systems had backups, and backups to backups. For everything to fail simultaneously suggested something more than mechanical breakdown. It suggested interference. Deliberate interference. The light outside had changed again. Its glow had intensified slightly, becoming more defined. Jessica, still taking notes, realized she could now see a shape within the light. Not a clear shape, not a distinct structure, but an impression of something solid beneath the luminescence, something with mass and form, even if the details remained obscured. She tried to make out more detail, pressing her face close to the window until her breath fogged the glass. The object seemed to pulse very slowly, so slowly she couldn't be certain she wasn't imagining it. A rhythmic variation in brightness that took maybe 20 seconds per cycle, like breathing, or like a signal. Torres saw it pulse and immediately thought the same thing. It was communicating, or trying to. He watched the pattern. Bright, slightly dimmer, bright again. Not Morse code, nothing that obvious, but definitely not random. There was an intelligence behind the variation, even if he couldn't decode what it was, trying to convey. It's responding to something, Price said. Watch, every time we transmit, it changes. Torres keyed the radio again, speaking into the dead silence. Unknown aircraft, this is Flight 227. We observe your presence. Please identify yourself. The light pulsed brighter, distinctly responding to the transmission. Not in a way that suggested it received the message. More like it detected the radio energy itself and acknowledged it. Price tried. If you can hear us, pulse twice. One pulse, but whether that was coincidence or actual communication was impossible to determine. They tried several more times, attempting different patterns, different frequencies, different power levels. Each time the object responded with changes in brightness, but the responses weren't consistent enough to establish clear communication. It was like trying to talk to something that understood you were making noise but couldn't interpret the meaning. Finally, Torres stopped trying. Whatever it was, traditional communication wasn't working. They were isolated in a bubble of silence, cut off from the world below, observed by something that wouldn't or couldn't explain itself. The flight continued, the engines ran steadily, the aircraft flew its programmed course. Everything was nominally normal, except for the complete absence of external communication and the presence of an inexplicable object that had rendered them unreachable. Passengers were starting to understand the situation. The more observant ones had pieced it together. Unusual object outside, strange effects, no communication with the ground. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted from curiosity to unease. Not panic, not yet, but a growing sense that they were experiencing something unprecedented. Marcus stood in the galley, looking at the faces of the passengers he could see. Some stared out windows, some had their eyes closed, either sleeping or pretending to sleep. Some looked at him, silently asking questions he couldn't answer. He wanted to tell them everything would be fine, but he wasn't certain it would be. He wasn't certain of anything anymore. Time passed, though how much was unclear. The clocks all showed different times now. Torres's watch, Price's watch, the instrument panel clocks, the cabin clocks, each told a different story. The discrepancies were growing. What had started as a minute or two of disagreement had expanded to 5-minute differences, and still no one could say which clock was correct, or if any of them were. The object maintained its position overhead, patient and persistent. Whatever it wanted, whatever it was doing, it wasn't finished yet. Chapter 5. The Missing Minutes. The change happened without warning. One moment the cabin was filled with the normal sounds of flight, the engine noise, the air conditioning system, a few whispered conversations among passengers. The next moment, those sounds faded into the background, becoming distant and unimportant, not gone, just less relevant. Jessica felt it first, a sensation of settling, as if gravity had changed slightly or the air pressure had shifted in a way that made everything more comfortable. She looked up from her notes and realized the cabin lights had dimmed. Not dramatically, not like someone had flipped a switch, just a gradual reduction in brightness that she hadn't consciously noticed happening. The other passengers felt it too. The businessman's eyelids grew heavy. The college student's head tilted back against the seat. The elderly woman's hands relaxed in her lap, her worry beads falling silent. One by one, everyone in the cabin slipped into a state that wasn't quite sleep but wasn't quite wakefulness either. A suspended moment where thoughts slowed and time became elastic. Marcus stood in the galley, his hand still gripping the counter, and felt the sensation wash over him. His body relaxed without his permission. His concerns faded to background noise. He was aware of himself standing there, aware of the aircraft, aware that something unusual was happening, but he couldn't quite summon the energy to care. It felt safe, peaceful, like the moment before falling asleep, when you're still conscious, but already dreaming. In the cockpit, Torres and Price experienced the same phenomenon. Torres saw the change in the lighting and reached for the dimmer switch, thinking maybe he'd accidentally adjusted it. But his hand moved slowly, as if through water. By the time his fingers reached the switch, he'd forgotten why he was reaching for it. He let his hand fall back to his lap. Price was staring at the instruments, watching them flicker and shift in ways that should have alarmed her. The altitude readout was cycling through different values. The heading indicator was slowly rotating, though the autopilot showed the aircraft was maintaining course. None of it made sense, yet she felt no urgency to correct it. The instruments were lying, but in this moment, that seemed acceptable. The aircraft continued flying. The autopilot maintained its programmed path, correcting for the minor disturbances that Price was watching but not processing. The engines hummed at their steady cruise power setting. Everything mechanical continued working exactly as designed. But the humans inside the aircraft had become passengers in a different sense, observers rather than participants. Time stopped being linear. Jessica would later swear that she was conscious throughout, that she'd watched the entire thing happen. But when she tried to describe how long it lasted, she couldn't. 5 minutes? 20? An hour? Her notes, which she'd been writing meticulously, showed a gap. The last entry before the change was time-stamped 0019. The next entry was 0038. But she had no memory of those 19 minutes passing. And even that didn't feel right, because she could have sworn only 5 minutes had elapsed. The businessman would, I remember, closing his eyes briefly and then opening them again immediately. But his watch showed 22 minutes had passed. Impossible. He'd been awake the entire time, hadn't he? The more he tried to remember, the less certain he became. The college student had the clearest memory, though even hers was fragmentary. She remembered the lights dimming. She remembered feeling calm. She remembered looking out the window and seeing the object outside, close enough now that she could see it wasn't just light. There was something solid beneath the glow, a surface, dark but reflective, curved. She stared at it, trying to make out details, but they wouldn't stay in focus. Every time she thought she saw something specific, an edge, a panel line, a symbol, it would slip away from her perception, like trying to remember a dream. She also remembered sounds, not from the aircraft, from outside or through the aircraft, or inside her head. She couldn't determine the source. They weren't mechanical sounds. They weren't voices. They were almost musical, but without melody. Tones that rose and fell in patterns that felt meaningful, but incomprehensible. She tried to hum along, to match the tones, but her voice wouldn't cooperate. The sounds were too complex, operating in frequencies she could hear but not reproduce. Then, just as gradually as it had begun, the suspension ended. The cabin lights brightened back to normal. The engine noise returned to full audibility. Passengers blinked and looked around. Confused and disoriented, several checked their watches or phones, trying to establish what time it was and failing to get a consistent answer. Marcus shook his head, feeling like he was waking up from a nap he didn't remember taking. He looked around the cabin, checking on passengers. Everyone seemed fine, physically fine anyway. But there was a collective expression of bewilderment. People looking at each other with questions in their eyes. Did you feel that? Did that just happen? In the cockpit, Torres and Price came back to full alertness, almost simultaneously. Torres's first action was to check the autopilot. Still engaged, course correct, altitude correct. Though correct was a relative term, since the instrument still couldn't agree on what the actual altitude was. Price checked her watch against the panel clock. The discrepancy had grown to 7 minutes now. "Did we just..." Price started, then stopped, not sure how to finish the sentence. "I don't know what we just did," Torres admitted. "I was conscious the whole time, I think, but I can't remember details." They reviewed the flight data recorder timestamps, looking for evidence of what had occurred. The recorder showed continuous operation, no gaps, but when they tried to correlate the timestamps with their watches and the panel clocks, nothing lined up. According to the recorder, 3 minutes had passed during the event. According to Torres's watch, 17 minutes had passed. According to Price's watch, 12 minutes. "This is going in every unusual occurrence report I write for the rest of my career," Price said quietly. Torres nodded. If they got the chance to write reports, if they landed, if any of this made sense later. He checked their position. According to the GPS, they were 23 miles from their next waypoint. That didn't match his calculations. They should be closer or farther. He couldn't remember. The numbers wouldn't stay in his head long enough to do the math. Outside, the object had moved again. It was no longer directly overhead. It had drifted back to a position alongside the aircraft, slightly behind the wing, returning to where it had started, though not exactly. The observation was concluding. Whatever it had wanted to examine, it had examined. Whatever data it needed to collect, it had collected. Jessica wrote in her notebook with shaking hands. "Lost time, everyone affected, object very close during the event, seemed to be inside my head, possible communication attempt or something else." She underlined "something else" 3 times, pressing hard enough to tear the paper slightly. Because it was something else. She was certain of that. This wasn't communication. This was something more direct, more intimate. The object hadn't just observed them during those missing minutes. It had connected to them somehow, touched their minds. Not invasively, not harmfully, but definitely purposefully. Other passengers were coming to similar conclusions, even if they couldn't articulate them clearly. The experience had been too strange, too unlike anything in their frame of reference to fit into words. They exchanged glances with each other, silent acknowledgement that something profound had occurred, something they would spend years trying to understand and probably never fully explain. The aircraft flew on. The missing minutes fell behind them, impossible to recover or fully remember. The clock showed whatever time it wanted to show, and the object, having completed its examination, prepared for its next move. Chapter 6. The Sudden Departure. It happened between one heartbeat and the next. Torres was looking directly at the object's position when it vanished. Not gradually, not accelerating away into the distance. It was simply there and then not there. Instantaneous absence. One frame of existence, then nothing. Like someone had deleted it from reality. "Did you see that?" he asked Price, though he knew she must have. "It's gone," she confirmed, her voice tight with disbelief. Completely gone. There was no trail, no heat signature on the infrared sensors, no radar return appearing as it moved away, no trace whatsoever that anything had been there seconds before. The darkness outside the aircraft was just darkness again, stars and scattered ground lights, and nothing else. Torres scanned the sky methodically, left to right, top to bottom, nothing. Price checked the collision avoidance system. No traffic shown within 50 miles. She tried the radar, adjusting the range and sensitivity. Still nothing. The object hadn't moved away at incredible speed. It had simply ceased to occupy that space. There one instant, elsewhere the next, with no transition between. In the cabin, passengers who had been watching felt a strange sense of loss. Jessica stared at the now empty sky where the object had been. She felt abandoned somehow, though that made no sense. The object had been following them uninvited, interfering with their flight, causing unexplainable effects. Its departure should have been a relief. Instead, she felt like something important had ended before she was ready for it to end. The cabin lights were fully bright now. The air felt normal. The pressure stabilized completely. The strange vibrational feeling in the airframe ceased. Everything snapped back to baseline normal, so quickly that passengers wondered if the entire experience had been real or some kind of shared hallucination. But the evidence was there. Jessica had her notes. The college student had timestamps on her phone, showing the impossible time gaps. The businessman had felt his ears pop during pressure changes that the instruments said never occurred. The elderly woman remembered the sounds no one else seemed to have heard. They couldn't all be mistaken or delusional. Marcus made his way through the cabin again, this time more carefully checking each passenger. "Is everyone all right?" he asked. "Anyone feeling ill, dizzy, disoriented?" Most passengers reported feeling fine, a little confused, a little tired, but physically fine. One man mentioned a slight headache. A woman said she felt like she'd forgotten something important, but couldn't remember what. Otherwise, no obvious ill effects. In the cockpit, Torres and Price were running through their systems one more time, looking for any lingering evidence of what had happened. The radios came back online gradually, first static, then broken communications, then clear signals. Torres keyed the transmitter. "Center Flight 227, radio check." The controller's voice came back immediately, sharp with concern. "Flight 227, we've been trying to reach you for the past 37 minutes. Say your status." 37 minutes. Torres and Price looked at each other. Had it been that long? According to the cockpit clocks, they'd lost contact for maybe 15 minutes. According to the controller, it had been more than twice that. More time discrepancies, more evidence that something had happened to their perception of duration. 227 is showing all systems normal now, Torres reported. We experienced complete communication loss and the presence of an unidentified object that has now departed our vicinity. Copy that, 227. We lost your transponder signal during that time. You disappeared from our scopes completely. We were about to scramble search and rescue. What's your current position? Price read off their GPS coordinates. There was a long pause from the controller. 227, that position puts you 42 miles ahead of where we expected you to be. Confirm your position? Torres rechecked the GPS. The coordinates were correct. They were indeed much farther along their route than they should be. At their cruising speed, covering that extra distance should have taken at least 10 additional minutes, but the flight time hadn't increased. If anything, they were ahead of schedule. Position confirmed, Torres said, trying to keep his voice steady. We show 42 miles past our last reported position. Another pause. The controller was clearly trying to make sense of information that didn't make sense. Roger 227. Continue present heading to your destination. We'll need a full report upon landing. Emergency services will meet your aircraft as a precaution. Understood, Torres replied. Emergency services. That meant fire trucks, medical, personnel, incident commanders. A full response. This was going to be complicated to explain. Assuming they could explain it at all, he made a PA announcement to the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain. The unusual event we experienced has concluded. The aircraft is operating normally, and we're continuing to our destination. We're ahead of schedule, and we'll be landing in approximately 28 minutes. Emergency services will meet us upon arrival as a standard precaution. This is routine procedure after any unusual occurrence. There's no current danger. Please remain seated with seatbelts fastened. Thank you. Routine procedure. That was technically true, though calling this situation routine was absurd. Still, it was the right thing to say. Keep people calm. Let them know what to expect. Don't speculate about things you don't understand. Price was updating their estimated arrival time. Based on their current position and speed, they were going to land early. Not by a few minutes, by a significant margin. The flight that should have taken an hour and 47 minutes was going to take just under an hour and 30 minutes. Time saved that couldn't be accounted for by wind or any other normal factor. She thought about the missing minutes during the period of calm. Had they not been missing at all? Had they been compressed somehow? Had the aircraft moved faster without anyone noticing? The speed indicators had shown normal cruise speed throughout, but clearly they'd covered more distance than should have been possible in the elapsed time. We might want to download the flight data recorder immediately after landing, she suggested. Before anyone else does. Torres understood her reasoning. The recorder would have objective data, speeds, altitudes, timestamps, everything. But if that data contradicted what they remembered, or showed something impossible, it might raise more questions than it answered. Still, she was right. They needed to see it first to understand what the aircraft thought had happened. Good idea, he said. First thing after shutdown. The remainder of the flight passed uneventfully. The instruments all agreed with each other again. The clock synchronized, though whether they synchronized to the correct time or just agreed on the same wrong time was unclear. Torres and Price monitored every system obsessively, looking for any sign that the encounter had caused damage or lasting effects. Everything checked good. In the cabin, passengers began to process what had happened. Some were already rationalizing it. Atmospheric phenomena, experimental military aircraft, some kind of electrical storm that affected their perceptions. The explanations varied, but the need to explain was universal. Humans can't tolerate mysteries. They need narratives, even inadequate ones. Jessica had stopped taking notes. She stared at her notebook, reading what she'd written, trying to match the words to her memories. The words were accurate as far as they went, but they didn't capture the experience, the feeling of connection, the sense of being examined by something vast and patient, the impression that the object hadn't just studied their aircraft, but had looked at them individually and understood something about each person it observed. She closed the notebook and looked out the window one last time. The sky was empty. The stars were just stars. Whatever had been with them was gone, off to wherever objects like that go when they finish observing a random regional flight. She felt certain she would never know what it was, never know where it came from, or what it wanted, never know if it would return or if this was a once-in-a-lifetime encounter. The thought made her profoundly sad in a way she couldn't explain. Chapter 7. The landing that feels wrong. The approach to the airport was textbook perfect. Torres configured the aircraft for landing, extending flaps and gear at the appropriate altitudes and speeds. The landing checklist was completed without errors. The tower cleared them to land on runway 28. Everything proceeded exactly as it should. Yet something felt fundamentally wrong. Price noticed it first. The tower just said we're 15 minutes early. Torres checked his watch, then the panel clock, then their estimated versus actual arrival time. All the timepieces in the cockpit now agreed they were arriving early, but they couldn't all agree on how early. His watch said 12 minutes, the panel clock said 18, the flight management computer said 7. Which one's right? He asked, not expecting an answer. They crossed the outer marker at precisely the correct altitude and speed. The runway light stretched out before them, a perfect ribbon of light in the darkness. Torres flew the approach manually, wanting the direct connection to the aircraft, needing to feel through the controls that everything was normal. The touchdown was smooth, the reversers deployed, the aircraft decelerated steadily, a perfect landing, but as they taxied off the runway, Price noticed something odd. The clock on the terminal building shows 0114. Torres looked. She was right. If the terminal clock was correct, they'd arrived 23 minutes early. Not ahead of their revised estimate. Ahead of their original scheduled arrival time. They'd covered a route that normally took an hour and 47 minutes in an hour and 24 minutes. Impossible with their aircraft's performance and the winds aloft they'd experienced. Ground control directed them to a remote parking position, away from the terminal. As they taxied, they could see the emergency vehicles staging nearby, 2 fire trucks, an ambulance, several cars with flashing lights. The full response. Torres felt embarrassed, as if they'd called in a false alarm, though he knew they'd done nothing wrong. He parked the aircraft and shut down the engines. The sudden silence felt profound. For the first time in over an hour, they had no engines running, no systems humming, no motion, just stillness. Price ran through the shutdown checklist mechanically, her hands moving through the familiar motions, while her mind tried to process everything that had happened. Before they could complete the checklist, there was a knock on the cockpit door. Torres opened it to find 3 men in dark suits, holding identification badges. Federal aviation investigators. That was fast. Too fast. These men had been waiting before the aircraft even landed. Captain Torres, the lead investigator asked. I'm Special Agent Brennan, Federal Aviation Administration. We need to secure this aircraft immediately. No one disembarks until we've conducted initial interviews. That includes your passengers. Torres nodded slowly. Understood. Are you aware of what we experienced? We're aware of an incident involving unidentified traffic and communication loss, Brennan said carefully. We need your cooperation in documenting everything that occurred. The passive voice, the careful phrasing. Torres recognized the tone of someone who knew more than they were saying. These investigators hadn't been scrambled in response to their radio call. They'd been positioned here, waiting, as if they'd known something would happen, or as if things like this happened often enough that investigators were always on standby. We'll cooperate fully, Torres assured him. But my passengers have been through a stressful experience. Some of them may need medical attention. Medical personnel are standing by, Brennan said. Everyone will be checked out. But first we need statements from you, your first officer, and your flight attendant. Then we'll process the passengers individually. Marcus appeared behind the investigators. How long will this take? Some of these passengers have connections to make. Brennan turned to him. Sir, are you the flight attendant? Good. You're also needed for an interview. As for connections, we're coordinating with the airline. New arrangements are being made. This takes priority. The cabin door opened and more officials boarded. Some medical personnel, some in uniforms Torres didn't recognize, some in civilian clothes carrying equipment. They moved through the cabin efficiently, professional but thorough. Passengers were asked to remain seated. Their phones were collected, they were told, for their own records and protection. Most complied without protest, too confused and tired to object. Jessica watched her phone being placed in a labelled evidence bag. When do I get that back? She asked. Soon, a young woman in a dark suit assured her. We just need to document some information. Standard procedure. Standard procedure. That phrase again. But there was nothing standard about any of this. Jessica clutched her notebook, which no one had asked for. Her handwritten notes were apparently not of interest. Only the digital devices, only the things that might have recorded objective evidence. Torres and Price were escorted off the aircraft into a mobile command unit that had been set up near the parking position. Inside, sophisticated recording equipment covered one wall. Brennan gestured for them to sit at a conference table. "Before we begin," Brennan said, "I need to inform you that this interview is being recorded and will form part of an official investigation. You're not under suspicion of any wrongdoing. We simply need accurate accounts of what you experienced. Please be as detailed as possible." For the next 2 hours, Torres and Price described everything. The initial sighting of the light, the instrument anomalies, the time discrepancies, the communication loss, the missing minutes, the object's departure. They were interrupted frequently with clarifying questions. What exactly did the object look like? How close did it get? What did the instruments show at each stage? Were there any physical effects on the crew or passengers? Brennan and his colleagues took notes continuously. They showed no surprise at anything Torres and Price described, which was itself surprising. These were experienced investigators hearing about an encounter with an unknown object that defied physics and made time unreliable, yet they reacted as if they were documenting a routine equipment malfunction. "Has this happened before?" Price finally asked. "You don't seem shocked by any of this." Brennan exchanged glances with his colleagues before answering carefully. "We're familiar with similar reports. I can't discuss details of other incidents, but you're not the first flight crew to experience something like this." Not the first. Torres absorbed that information. How many others? How often? And why didn't anyone know about it? Why wasn't this making headlines? "What happens now?" he asked. "We complete our investigation," Brennan said. "We'll examine the aircraft for any physical evidence. We'll interview all passengers and crew. We'll analyze the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder. Then we'll compile a report." "Will that report be public?" "That hasn't been determined yet. It depends on what we find." Which meant no. The report would be classified or buried or filed under some obscure regulation that kept it from public view. Torres felt a surge of frustration, but suppressed it. Arguing wouldn't help. These men were following procedures established long before tonight. Meanwhile, in the terminal, passengers were being interviewed individually in small rooms that had been hastily set up. Jessica sat across from a woman in her 40s, wearing business casual clothes and an expression of professional sympathy. "I'm Dr. Margaret Reed," the woman introduced herself. "I'm a psychologist working with the investigation team. I want to talk to you about what you experienced. I know this has been stressful." Jessica almost laughed. Stressful. That was one way to describe it. "Am I allowed to keep my notes?" she asked, holding up her notebook. "Of course," Reed said. "Those are yours. I'd like to hear about what you saw and felt in your own words." Jessica walked her through the entire experience. The initial sighting, the way the object moved, the strange feelings during the missing minutes, the sounds she might have heard. Reed listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes on a tablet. "Did you feel threatened at any point?" Reed asked when Jessica finished. "No," Jessica admitted. "That's the strange part. I should have been terrified, but I wasn't. It was more like being studied, like a specimen under a microscope, except the microscope was conscious and curious." Reed nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "And now? How do you feel about the experience now that it's over?" "Confused, frustrated, like I witnessed something important, but I'm not allowed to talk about it or investigate it or understand it. They took my phone, my photos and videos. Those will be returned after analysis," Reed assured her. "You'll get everything back." "But the photos won't show anything," Jessica said. "I tried to take pictures. The camera couldn't capture it properly. Whatever it was doesn't translate to digital images." Reed made a note of that. "Interesting. Why do you think that is?" "I don't know. Maybe it operates in wavelengths cameras can't detect. Maybe it somehow interferes with electronic recording. Or maybe it just doesn't want to be recorded." You think it made that choice to avoid being recorded? Jessica considered. I think it made a lot of choices. Where to position itself, when to move closer, when to leave. Everything about it suggested intention and intelligence. The interview continued for another 30 minutes. Reed asked about Jessica's background, her job, her mental health history, her stress levels, whether she used any medications or substances. Jessica answered truthfully. Understanding this was as much about assessing her credibility as about documenting the event. Finally, Reed thanked her and said she was free to go. The airline has arranged hotel rooms for everyone since your connections were missed. Transportation is being provided. Someone will contact you tomorrow about retrieving your phone and any follow-up questions. Jessica stepped out of the interview room to find most of the other passengers waiting in a cordoned-off section of the terminal. They looked at each other with a strange mixture of solidarity and isolation. They'd shared an experience no one else would understand or believe. That created a bond, but also a barrier between them and the rest of the world. The businessman approached her. Did they ask you not to talk about it? Not in so many words, Jessica said, but the implication was clear. Same here. He looked around to make sure no officials were nearby. My company is going to think I'm crazy when I explain why I missed my meeting. Tell them. Equipment malfunction, Jessica suggested. That's technically true. Yeah, he didn't sound convinced. Equipment malfunction, sure. They were loaded onto buses and driven to a nearby hotel. Jessica was given a room key and told breakfast would be provided in the morning. She rode the elevator up alone, walked down the quiet hallway, unlocked her door, and stood in the generic hotel room, feeling completely disconnected from reality. She sat on the bed and opened her notebook again, reading through her entries. The handwriting was hers. The observations were accurate, but they already felt distant, as if they'd happened to someone else. She added one final entry. Landed safely. Time discrepancies unresolved. Phone confiscated. Interviewed by investigators who weren't surprised by anything. They've seen this before. How many times? Why don't we know? I witnessed something extraordinary, and I'm already being encouraged to forget it, or dismiss it, or file it away as unexplained. But I won't forget. I can't. She closed the notebook and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Somewhere above her, thousands of aircraft were in flight right now. Most would complete their journeys without incident, but some, maybe just a few, would encounter something they couldn't explain. And those encounters would be documented, investigated, and buried, added to a file somewhere that few people had access to or knew existed. The thought was simultaneously terrifying and oddly comforting. Terrifying because it meant this was part of a pattern, not an isolated incident. Comforting because it meant she wasn't alone in her experience. Others had been through something similar. Others carried the same unexplainable memories. She closed her eyes but knew sleep wouldn't come easily. Tonight. Chapter 8. Quiet Instructions. Morning arrived with unexpected efficiency. Jessica woke to find an envelope had been slid under her door. Inside was a printed itinerary, a boarding pass for a flight later that day, and a business card with a phone number, and the words, "If you experience any lasting effects or have concerns, please contact this number." No signature, no explanation of what qualified as lasting effects. Just a number and an implicit suggestion that there might be consequences she hadn't yet considered. The other passengers gathered in the hotel restaurant for breakfast. They recognized each other immediately. A small group bonded by shared experience. Conversations were quiet, almost conspiratorial. No one knew quite what they were allowed to say, or what would happen if they said too much. The businessman, whose name Jessica learned was David, sat down at her table. They returned my phone this morning. Everything's still on it. My photos, my messages, but there's something weird. What? All my photos from the flight are corrupted. Not missing, corrupted. Like they're there, but the data is scrambled. I had 3 photos from before the incident that were fine. Everything after we noticed the light is just random pixels. Jessica checked her own returned phone. Same thing. Her photos from earlier in the day were perfect. Everything from the flight was garbage. Deliberately damaged, she suspected, though proving it would be impossible. The elderly woman from seat 3C joined them. Her name was Helen. "Did anyone else have strange dreams last night?" she asked quietly. Several passengers nodded. Jessica had dreamed of lights and tones, conversations without words, a sense of being shown something important that she couldn't quite remember upon waking. Others described similar experiences, dreams of flight, of observation, of communication attempts that failed not because of language barriers, but because of conceptual barriers. Humans and something not human trying to find common ground and almost succeeding. "I think it tried to talk to us," Helen said. "During those missing minutes, I think that's what happened. Not with words, with something else. And we almost understood." No one contradicted her. The explanation felt right in a way that scientific rationalization didn't. Whatever the object was, it had been intelligent. It had chosen to approach them, to follow them, to examine them. And during those suspended minutes, it had reached out in the only way it could. Marcus appeared in the restaurant, still in his uniform. He looked tired. "The investigators kept me until 3 a.m, he said, accepting coffee from Jessica's offered cup. They wanted every detail, what passengers did, what they said, whether anyone seemed affected physically or psychologically." "And?" David asked. "Everyone checked out fine," Marcus said. "No injuries, no lasting physical effects, but they did neurocognitive tests on me. Memory tests, reaction time tests, stuff I don't think is standard procedure for a flight incident." "What were they looking for?" Jessica asked. "I think they wanted to know if the encounter changed us somehow, if being that close to whatever it was left some kind of mark we can't see, but they can measure." "Did it?" Helen asked. Marcus shrugged. "They didn't share the results, but I feel different. Not bad different, just different. More aware maybe, like some sense I didn't know I had got switched on." Others nodded. They felt it too. A heightened perception. An awareness of spaces and patterns they'd never noticed before. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would show up on tests, but definitely there. Later that morning, a man in a dark suit gathered all the passengers in a hotel conference room. He introduced himself as Robert Chen from the National Transportation Safety Board. He looked tired, like he'd been awake as long as Marcus. "I want to thank you all for your cooperation," Chen began. "The investigation is ongoing, but I can share some preliminary findings. The aircraft suffered no mechanical failures. All systems operated within normal parameters throughout the flight. The communication loss was temporary and resolved itself. Air traffic control did briefly lose radar contact with your flight, but you were never in danger." Carefully chosen words, true as far as they went, but missing the entire point. Jessica raised her hand. "What about the object? What was it?" Chen's expression didn't change. "The object you observed has not been identified. We're consulting with various agencies and specialists. When we have more information, we'll update you." "So you're not going to tell us," David said flatly. "I'm telling you what I can tell you," Chen replied. "Some aspects of the investigation involve security considerations I'm not authorized to discuss." Security considerations. Military involvement then, or intelligence agencies, or both. Jessica felt her frustration growing, but kept her expression neutral. Arguing with Chen wouldn't accomplish anything. "Can we talk about this publicly?" Helen asked. "Are we allowed to tell people what happened?" Chen measured his response carefully. You're not forbidden from discussing your experience. However, I'd caution you that aviation incidents are often misreported in media. Speculation and inaccurate accounts can be harmful to ongoing investigations. We'd appreciate your discretion. Not forbidden, just strongly discouraged. The message was clear. Talk if you want, but no one will believe you, and you might interfere with important work. What about our flight crew? Jessica asked. Are they allowed to fly again? Captain Torres and First Officer Price have been cleared for duty. They'll undergo additional evaluation, but there's no reason to ground them. Marcus Webb will also return to normal duties. At least that was something. The crew wouldn't be punished for reporting what they'd seen. That suggested the authorities took this seriously, even if they wouldn't admit it publicly. Chen distributed more business cards with contact numbers. If any of you experience delayed effects, headaches, memory issues, unusual dreams, anything concerning, please call this number immediately. Medical consultation is available at no cost to you. After the meeting, passengers dispersed to catch their rescheduled flights. Jessica found herself in the elevator with the college student whose name was Emma. Are you going to talk about it? Emma asked. Online, I mean? Social media? Jessica had already considered this. No one would believe me anyway. They'd say I'm looking for attention or that I imagined it. Without physical evidence, it's just a story. I recorded some audio on my phone, Emma said quietly. During the missing minutes, I didn't tell the investigators. I turned on a voice recorder app right before everything got weird. And? It recorded 23 minutes of audio, but I only remember 5 minutes passing. And the audio is strange. There's a sound throughout, like a hum or a tone. Not from the aircraft, something else. I can't explain it, but it's there. Are you going to share it? Emma hesitated. I don't know. Part of me wants to, but part of me thinks maybe some things shouldn't be shared. Maybe some experiences are meant to stay private. The elevator doors opened. They walked through the lobby together, then separated to catch their different flights. Jessica never saw Emma again. Never knew if she shared that audio or kept it to herself. Chapter 9. After Effects. 3 weeks later, Jessica woke up at exactly 3:14 in the morning. She'd been doing this every night since the incident. Waking at the same time, feeling alert and aware, unable to fall back asleep for at least an hour. Her doctor suggested stress-related sleep disruption and offered medication. Jessica declined. The wakefulness didn't feel pathological. It felt purposeful, though she couldn't explain why. During those wakeful hours, she found herself thinking about the encounter. Not obsessing, just reflecting, processing details that her conscious mind had missed but her subconscious had recorded. She remembered textures of light, subtle variations in the object's glow, the way it had seemed to breathe or pulse with a rhythm that felt organic rather than mechanical. She tried to research similar incidents online. There were countless UFO reports, of course, but most were vague or sensational, or obviously hoaxes. Only a few had the specific details that matched her experience. Commercial flights, followed by unidentified objects, instrument anomalies, time discrepancies, missing minutes, professional crews reporting in careful language that suggested they knew they wouldn't be fully believed. One report from 7 years earlier described almost exactly what she'd experienced. Different aircraft, different crew, different location. But the pattern was identical. The object following at a distance, then moving closer, then positioning itself overhead during a period of lost time, then departing instantaneously. The crew had been interviewed by federal investigators. The incident was classified as unexplained aerial phenomenon and filed away. David, the businessman, had started a private online forum. Just for the 11 people who'd been on flight 227. A place to share observations and compare notes without public scrutiny. Jessica joined and found the others posting regularly. Marcus reported that he could navigate better now, not just professionally, in all aspects of life. He'd always had a good sense of direction, but now it was almost preternatural. He could orient himself instantly in unfamiliar places, sense cardinal directions without visual cues, navigate complex spaces with confidence that bordered on instinct. Helen posted about dreams, vivid, detailed dreams of places she'd never been. Not Earth places, or maybe Earth from perspectives she couldn't normally achieve. Views from high altitude, showing terrain patterns she'd later verify using satellite imagery. How did her sleeping mind know what the Montana Badlands looked like from 30,000 feet when she'd never flown over them? Emma shared her audio recording in the private forum. The others listened to the 23 minutes of sound. The aircraft noises were there. Engines, air conditioning, the occasional passenger cough or seat adjustment. But underneath was something else. A tone that wavered and shifted, almost melodic but not quite. It had structure, intentionality. Several forum members reported feeling strange while listening to it. Calm, focused, aware. It's in the recording because it was in the aircraft, Emma wrote. It wasn't outside or in our heads. It was everywhere. In the space around us. In the air itself. Captain Torres didn't join the forum, but Jessica saw an interview he gave to an aviation safety publication. He was careful in his wording, professional and measured. But between the lines, she could read his frustration. He'd encountered something that challenged his understanding of physics and reality. He documented it thoroughly. And the official response was essentially, "Thanks for the report, we'll look into it. Please don't make a fuss." Price had transferred to international routes, longer flights, maybe hoping to encounter it again, or maybe wanting to be over open ocean, where incidents would be less noticed, less documented. Jessica understood both motivations. She also started paying attention to other people on airplanes. Not obviously, just watching, noticing. And occasionally she'd see someone with a certain look, a distant awareness, a way of watching the sky through the window that suggested they'd seen something too. She never approached them. What would she say? But she noted them, fellow witnesses to the impossible. Her watch still ran slow, exactly 47 seconds slow per day. She'd had it serviced twice. The technician insisted it was working perfectly, but it wasn't. It was running on time as experienced during the encounter rather than conventional time, a permanent souvenir of those missing minutes. David reported similar issues with his devices. His tablet's internal clock drifted. His laptop's timestamp was always slightly off. All his electronics from that flight had been subtly altered. They worked fine. They just operated on a slightly different temporal framework. The forum discussions became deeper over time, less about documenting what happened and more about what it meant. Why that flight? Why those passengers? Why that night? Were they chosen specifically, or were they just convenient? Had the object learned anything useful, or was the encounter meaningless from its perspective? "Maybe we're asking the wrong questions," Helen posted one night. "Maybe it's not about why it chose us. Maybe it's about what we do with having been chosen." Jessica thought about that for a long time. She'd gone back to her normal life. Same job, same apartment, same routines, but something fundamental had changed. She noticed things now. Patterns in seemingly random events, connections between disparate facts, a sense that reality was more complex and more fragile than she'd previously believed. She'd also become more comfortable with uncertainty. Before the encounter, she'd needed explanations for everything. Now she could accept that some experiences didn't have satisfactory explanations. Some questions didn't have answers. Some mysteries remained mysterious, and that was okay. Marcus posted a photo one morning. He was standing in a field, looking up at a clear dawn sky. The caption read, "1 month anniversary. Still looking up. Still hoping." Others posted similar photos. Helen at her kitchen window, David on his apartment balcony, Emma on a hiking trail, all looking up, all waiting, not with fear or anxiety, with something closer to anticipation or hope. Jessica understood. They'd been touched by something vast and strange. They'd been given a glimpse behind the curtain of ordinary reality, and while the experience had ended, its effects persisted. They were different now, aware in ways they hadn't been before, connected to something larger than their individual lives. Epilogue: Wyatt chose a plane. The official report was released 4 months after the incident. Jessica found it through a Freedom of Information Act request. 47 pages, heavily redacted, concluding that Flight 227 had experienced unexplained aerial phenomena and temporary instrument anomalies that did not compromise flight safety. No determination regarding the nature or origin of the observed object. Case closed. She printed it out and added it to a folder she'd been keeping. Her personal notes, the forum discussions, news articles about similar incidents, academic papers about time perception and group psychology. She wasn't trying to prove anything, just trying to understand. Late one evening, she stood at her apartment window, looking up at the flight paths overhead. Aircraft passed constantly, their navigation lights tracing predictable paths across the sky, each one carrying dozens or hundreds of people who expected routine journeys, who trusted that physics and technology and human skill would deliver them safely to their destinations. Most would get that routine journey, but some wouldn't. Some would encounter something that didn't fit the script. And when they landed and tried to explain what had happened, they'd find themselves speaking a language no one else quite understood. She thought about Torres's words in that Aviation Journal interview. "We operate in a space between earth and sky, neither fully grounded nor fully free." Perhaps that makes us interesting to things that want to understand the boundary between. Aircraft exist in a liminal space, high enough to be separate from terrestrial concerns, but not high enough to be truly in space, fast enough to make distance meaningless, but not fast enough to escape atmosphere. Their human technology pushed to the edge of what's possible without leaving the planet entirely. Maybe that's what made them interesting. Maybe the object had been studying the boundary between Earth and not Earth, between terrestrial and extraterrestrial. And commercial aircraft, with their regular routes and predictable behaviour, made perfect observation platforms. Convenient, accessible, comprehensible. The encounter hadn't been about the passengers. It hadn't even really been about the aircraft. They'd just been there, available, a sample of human technology and human consciousness moving through a specific region of space at a specific time. The object had studied them, collected whatever data it needed, and moved on to the next observation. Jessica found that thought oddly comforting. They weren't special, weren't chosen, weren't important in any cosmic sense. They were just convenient, and that meant the universe wasn't paying particular attention to humanity. We weren't significant enough to be targeted or threatened. We were just interesting enough to be occasionally worth examining. Her phone buzzed. A notification from the forum. Helen had posted, "Anyone else wake up at 3:14? Responses came quickly. David. "Every night." Emma. "Same, what is that?" Marcus. "Timestamp from when we were closest to it, maybe? When the connection was strongest?" They were still connected, not to the object, necessarily, but to each other, bound by shared experience that no one else could fully understand. 11 people who'd been in the wrong place at the right time to see something extraordinary and had to live the rest of their lives with the knowledge that reality was bigger and stranger than any of them had imagined. Jessica typed her response. I think it marked us somehow. Not physically, but we were changed. We're measuring time differently now, perceiving space differently, operating on a frequency we didn't have access to before. Helen replied, So what do we do with that? Good question. What do you do when you've been fundamentally altered by an encounter with the inexplicable? Go back to normal? Pretend it didn't happen? Or accept the change and try to understand what you've become? Jessica thought about her answer for a long time before typing. We watch the sky. We notice things others miss. We stay open to possibilities. And if it ever happens again, to us or anyone else, we'll recognize it. We'll know what to look for. Marcus, you think it will happen again? Jessica watched a plane pass overhead, its lights blinking in the familiar pattern. I think it never stopped happening. We just usually don't notice, but now we will. The forum went quiet after that. Not because there was nothing more to say, but because everything important had been said. They were watchers now, witnesses to the impossible who'd been given the gift of awareness. They'd spend the rest of their lives looking up, noticing, wondering, and maybe, just maybe, one of them would see it again. That pale light in the darkness, that presence that defied explanation. And they'd know they weren't alone in their awareness, that somewhere out there, other intelligences moved through the same universe, occasionally intersecting with human experience in ways that could never be fully explained or understood. Jessica closed her laptop and returned to the window. The sky was clear. The stars were bright. Somewhere above, aircraft continued their journeys. And somewhere even higher, perhaps things that weren't aircraft moved for reasons humanity couldn't comprehend. She thought about the object's final moment, its instantaneous departure. One frame of existence, then absence. No transition, no explanation. Just gone. The way it had appeared was the way it disappeared, without regard for human understanding or human rules about how things should behave. Some encounters happen not because we are important, she thought, but because we are convenient, because we were there, because we were moving through the right space at the right time, because something vast and patient wanted to observe the strange creatures who strap themselves into metal tubes and throw themselves across the sky, trusting in machines and math to keep them alive. The object had observed. It had learned whatever it came to learn, and then it had moved on, leaving behind only questions and subtle changes in the people who'd been closest to it. That was enough. It had to be enough, because that was all they'd ever get. Jessica turned away from the window and went to bed. At 3:14, she'd wake up, as she always did now, and she'd lie there in the darkness, feeling the altered rhythm of her consciousness, aware of the gift she'd been given, the absolute certainty that reality was deeper and stranger than anyone wanted to admit. And in the morning she'd get up, go to work, live her life, different now, aware now, forever marked by the flight that never quite landed in the reality she'd left behind. Case file 772247, unexplained aerial phenomenon, status archived. Final note, 11 passengers, 3 crew members, 0 casualties, aircraft undamaged. Incident attributed to atmospheric conditions and perceptual anomalies. No further investigation warranted. Addendum. All subjects continue to report minor sleep disruptions and temporal perception anomalies. Long-term monitoring recommended but not required. Similar incidents have occurred with comparable frequency since records began. pattern suggests ongoing low-level contact that does not pose immediate threat to aviation safety. Recommendation: maintain current protocols, document but do not publicize, ensure crew and passengers receive appropriate psychological support, continue monitoring for emergence of additional effects. The phenomenon persists. We adapt.